The body in Cordelia Vane's wagon bed was still breathing, which was the first problem. The second problem was that half of Hatchet Creek had watched her drag him out of the mud behind the Silver Spur Saloon at 10 past midnight, and by morning the story would have grown legs and walked itself into something she could not correct. She knew how towns talked. She'd been in enough of them to recognize the sound a reputation made when it started to crack like green wood in a fire, slow and then all at once. She flicked the reins. The mule Clover didn't much care about reputation. Clover cared about the smell of the livery barn at the end of the road and moved toward it with the single-minded purpose that Cordelia envied most evenings. The man in the back groaned. Not dead then, not dying from the sound of it, though she'd reserved judgment until she got him somewhere with better light. She'd found him face down in 3 inches of rainwater in Georgia red clay with a knife wound along his ribs and someone's boot print on the back of his coat. He'd been stripped of his gun belt. His pockets had been turned inside out. They'd left him his boots, which she thought said something unflattering about the quality of the boots. She pulled around behind the freight office, which she leased from a man named Pruitt, who stayed out of her business as long as she paid on time, which she always did. She unhitched Clover, got the lantern lit, and climbed into the wagon to take a proper look. He was big. That was the first honest assessment. Well past 6 feet and built the way men got when the work was the kind that didn't stop wide across the shoulders hands, like he'd been squeezing saddle leather since before he could walk. He had a face she couldn't quite read in the lantern light, early 30s maybe, or younger than he looked, which happened to men who'd been outdoors their whole lives in country that didn't give quarter. His jaw was dark with stubble, and his left cheekbone was swelling from where something or someone had introduced itself with considerable force. The knife wound wasn't as bad as the blood had made it look. Deep enough to need stitching, not deep enough to have found anything vital. Someone had wanted to make a point, not a corpse. She got to work. She'd learned to stitch wounds from the regimental surgeon who traveled with the supply train her father ran during the war, a thin, pale man from Philadelphia who had the steadiest hands she'd ever seen and who believed as an article of personal faith that anyone who drew breath in proximity to a field hospital ought to know what to do with a needle. She'd been 11 years old. She had not forgotten. The man regained consciousness while she was finishing the third stitch. She knew because his breathing changed and then his hand moved not toward her, just the instinctive grasping of someone who'd woken in an unexpected situation and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. Still, she said without looking up, "I'm not done." A pause. Then he went still. She tied off the last stitch and sat back. He was looking at the ceiling of the wagon with the careful, focused attention of a man getting his bearings without appearing to get his bearings. "You're behind the Pruitt freight office," she said. "You're in my wagon. I pulled you out of the alley behind the Silver Spur. You've been stitched up and you're not dying." She set down the needle. "Those are the facts available to you at this moment." He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that shifted with the light. The expression in them was the expression of a man making rapid calculations. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out rough, but not weak. "Cordelia Vane. I run freight on the eastern run between here and Macon's Crossing." She looked at him steadily. "Who are you?" a beat, just long enough to be deliberate. "Jeremiah Cord," he said. She had been told lies before. She recognized the shape of them, the slight hesitation, the name that came out just a fraction too smooth, like something that had been practiced. She filed it away. "All right, Jeremiah Cord," she said. "Can you sit up?" He could with some evident effort and without asking for help, which she noted. She helped him anyway because stubbornness was admirable in principle and lethal in practice, and she didn't need him tearing the stitching before the sun was up. "The men who did this to you," she said, "they'll know you're not dead." "Yes," he said. "They'll look for you in the morning." "Yes. So you can't stay in my wagon or my freight office because they'll come here when they run out of other places to look, and I've got a business to protect." She held the lantern up and looked at him directly. "I'm not putting you back in the alley, but I need you on your feet and somewhere that isn't mine before first light." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than that. "You don't know who I am," he said. "I know you're hurt, and somebody wants you that way," she said. "Past that, no, I don't know who you are." "That doesn't concern you." "It concerns me considerably," she said, "but it concerns me less than leaving a breathing man to drown in 3 inches of mud." She handed him a piece of cloth to press against his side. Now, where can you go? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him run through the options the way a man ran through things when most of the options had already been eliminated. There's a woman at the church, he said. Reverend Alderman's wife. She knows me. Mrs. Alderman won't ask questions, Cordelia said. It wasn't a question. She knew Clara Alderman had hauled a load of Bibles for her once and a load of considerably less sanctified goods twice, and Clara Alderman was the kind of woman who'd see a hurt man and act on it without requiring a full accounting of his life first. No, he said. She won't. Can you walk? Give me a minute. She gave him 3. During those 3 minutes, he sat in the back of her wagon and breathed with the deliberate, controlled rhythm of a man managing pain, and she put away her kit and blew out the lantern and listened to the silence of Hatchet Creek at 2 in the morning. It was a particular kind of silence she'd always thought that frontier towns achieved in the small hours. Not peace, just the temporary absence of its opposite. She helped him out of the wagon. He was heavier than he'd looked, horizontal and warm from the blood loss and the cold night air working on him. And for a moment, when his hand gripped her shoulder, she felt the specific weight of him as something more than logistics. She set that aside. There were things you noticed and things you acted on, and the discipline was in knowing which was which. They crossed 3 blocks of Hatchet Creek in the dark, staying off the main street, and she got him to the side door of the parsonage and knocked twice and then twice again in the pattern Clara used for late deliveries. The door opened without delay, which meant Clara Alderman slept light or not at all. She looked at the man, then at Cordelia. Come in, she said, and stood back. Cordelia said, I have a delivery at dawn. I'll be back in the afternoon if you need anything. Clara nodded. The man turned at the threshold and looked back at her. The door was behind him and the dark was behind her, and there were 2 feet of cold Georgia air between them. Thank you, he said. He said it the way a person said something they didn't have a lot of practice saying, like it was real and it cost something. Don't tear my stitching, she said. She walked back to the freight office, alone in the dark. The delivery was to a homestead 12 miles east of Hatchet Creek, a family named Bowen who had a standing order for flour and seed, and occasionally the kind of dry goods that made a remote farm livable instead of merely survivable. She made the run in good time because the road had dried from last night's rain, and Clover was in a cooperative mood, and she was back by early afternoon with a belly full of Mrs. Bowen's cornbread and her mind running through what she'd seen the night before at approximately the same pace it had been running since she'd first pulled a breathing man out of the mud. 3 things she kept returning to. First, the knife wound was deliberate. Whoever had put it there knew exactly where to put a blade to make a point without ending a life. That took either skill or familiarity with the particular anatomy they were working on. Second, the name Jeremiah. Cord had the sound of something chosen rather than given. She'd used an assumed name herself once for 6 weeks in 1869 after a freight contract gone badly wrong in Savannah had made her own name temporarily inconvenient. She knew the feel of it, the way a borrowed name sat slightly differently in the mouth. Third, no gun belt. Men in this part of Georgia didn't go into saloons without a gun belt unless they'd made an active decision to do so or unless they'd been disarmed. The boot print on his coat suggested the latter, but the gun belt had been taken, not lost in the struggle, which meant someone wanted him without it. You stripped a man's gun when you wanted him afraid. She pulled Clover up at the livery and walked to the parsonage. Clara answered the door with the expression of a woman who had assessed a situation and arrived at a position she intended to hold. He's sleeping, she said. I won't wake him, Cordelia said. I just wanted to check the wound. Clara stepped aside. She had a quality Clara Alderman of stepping aside without making it feel like admission. Cordelia appreciated this in her. He was on the narrow cot in the back room, the one Clara kept for travelers who needed somewhere that wasn't the saloon, and he was not sleeping. He had the flat quiet of a man pretending to sleep, which Cordelia recognized because she'd done it herself enough times to know what it looked like. I can hear you breathing, she said. He opened his eyes. I was resting. You were awake. She pulled the chair from beside the cot and sat down. The wound looks all right. No fever yet. You'll want to watch for that in the next day or 2. I know. You've had wounds before. I know how wounds go. She looked at him in the afternoon light coming through the parsonage window. He looked better than he had at 2 in the morning in a lantern-lit wagon, which was not a high standard, but it was a standard. The swelling on his cheekbone had deepened to purple. His eyes were clearer. Jeremiah Cord, she said. That's right. You said it too smooth last night, she said, like you'd said it a few times to get used to the sound of it. He was quiet for a moment. You're observant, he said. Not an accusation, not a compliment either. Just a fact he was incorporating. I run freight in country where being unobservant gets you robbed, she said. It's a professional requirement. She folded her hands on her knee. I'm not asking you to tell me your real name. I'm asking you to tell me something true because I did something that put myself in the path of whoever hurt you, and I'd like to know what that path looks like. He studied her. She let him study. It was the kind of look that was doing real work, assessing not just her face, but the whole of her, the freight-worn coat and the capable hands, and the direct way she held herself in the chair. She'd been assessed by better and worse men than this one, and she'd learned not to move during it because moving was information, and she chose what information she gave. My name, he said, is not Jeremiah Cord. I know. What it is, he said, is something I'm not in a position to tell you until I know more about who you are and what you intend to do with the knowing. She accepted this. Fair enough. Then tell me something else. The men who cut you, are they going to come looking for trouble in Hatchet Creek? His jaw worked. Possibly. At the freight office? A pause. I don't know. That's not a satisfying answer. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at the ceiling. There are people in this county who have an interest in keeping me quiet. The men last night were working for them. Whether they come back depends on whether those people decide the point was made or whether they want to finish what they started. He paused. If I had to guess, I'd say they'll give it a day or two before they make that decision. Which gives you a day or two. Yes. Cordelia stood up. Then you'd better heal fast. She moved the chair back to its spot by the wall. I'll bring supper. Clara's cooking is righteous but not generous. He almost said something. She watched it move across his face, whatever it was, and stop before it came out. You don't have to do that, he said. I'm not doing it for you, she said. I'm doing it because unanswered questions keep me awake and I work better rested. She picked up her hat from the floor. I'll be back at 6. She went back to work. She brought beef stew and biscuits and a pot of coffee that Clara Alderman pretended not to notice being transferred from Cordelia's saddlebag to her kitchen. Clara had the grace of a woman who'd learned a long time ago that some things were handled best by looking somewhere else. He sat up to eat, which she'd expected. He ate with the focused deliberateness of someone who understood that food was fuel and was taking in fuel with purpose rather than pleasure. Though she noticed that he ate all of it, which was a good sign for a man 2/3 through a night of blood loss. What kind of freight do you run, he said. Dry goods mostly, hardware sometimes. I had a contract with the railroad survey team 2 years ago, which was the most profitable 6 months of my life and also the loudest. She poured coffee. Eastward mostly. Macon's crossing to Hatchet Creek, sometimes down to Dalton. You run it alone. Me and Clover and a hired hand named Wash who works 3 days a week and can lift more than most men I've seen. She passed him the cup. What about you? Before whatever got you face down in a mud puddle. He held the cup in both hands. The hands were scarred in the particular way of men who'd done outdoor work with tools, not the knuckle scars of fighting, but the palm and finger scars of rope and wood and iron. Land work, he said. Surveying. Adjacent to it. He drank. I spent 3 years cataloging title disputes for a land company out of Atlanta. She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. Title disputes in this county, among others. What kind of disputes? He set the cup down. She'd pushed to the edge of what he'd talk about easily, and she watched him decide whether to keep going. The kind, he said, that turn out to not be disputes at all, that turn out to be straightforward theft conducted through paperwork rather than a pistol. He looked at his hands. There are families in 3 counties that lost land to the Meridian Development Company between 1870 and 1874. Homestead claims mostly. Some inheritance parcels. The company would find a filing irregularity real or manufactured and foreclose. The families would lose the land and have nowhere to challenge it because the challenge would need to go through the county clerk's office, and the county clerk was on the company's payroll. Cordelia set her own cup down. You know this, she said, specifically. I documented it, he said, 2 years of it. I built a record of 78 separate fraudulent foreclosures. Names, dates, the specific mechanism of each title manipulation. I brought it to an attorney in Atlanta who I believed was independent. He paused. He was not. And the record, gone, he said. Or most of it. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen once on a man who'd survived a building fire and was still deciding how to feel about the survival. But not all of it. The fire in Clara's stove ticked in the quiet. Outside, Hatchet Creek was getting into its evening routine, the particular sounds of a small town negotiating the transition from workday to night, horses and voices, and the distant dull note of a saloon piano that someone was playing with more enthusiasm than talent. The men who cut you, Cordelia said. Meridian Development Company. Men working for the principal behind it, he said. A man named Harlan who runs the company through a series of business arrangements that make him very difficult to reach with anything legal. Who is he? Publicly one of the most respected businessmen in this part of Georgia. He funds schools, he endows churches. His name is on a hospital wing in Macon. He said this with the flatness of a man who had processed the information too many times for it to still carry heat, though she suspected it still carried something underneath. Privately, he is the architect of the largest systematic land fraud in this state's post-war history. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. She thought about the freight routes she ran, the homesteads and small farms she'd watched change hands over the years, the families who'd left the county with a look she'd never quite been able to name and now thought she could. What's left of the record, she said. Where is it? He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you asking that, he said. Because, she said, I want to understand what you have and what you need. What I need, he said carefully, is to get what I have in front of a judge who isn't in Halloran's pocket before Halloran's men find me and make this wound significantly worse. There's a federal circuit judge, she said, a man named Ira Cobb. He comes through Dalton every 6 weeks. He's from Pennsylvania. No connections I've ever heard of to any Georgia land interests. He stared at her. How do you know that? Because I have a freight contract with the federal court's messenger service, and I read the paperwork I signed. She picked up the pot and poured him more coffee. When is he next in Dalton? I don't know. I can find out, she said. Tomorrow morning. She stood up and started gathering the dishes. In the meantime, rest. Don't tear my stitching. And think about whether you want to tell me where the rest of the record is. You're not a lawyer, he said. No, she said. But I know every road in 3 counties, and I know which ones Halloran's men watch and which ones they don't. And I have a freight wagon that goes places without looking like it's going anywhere suspicious. She picked up her hat. Sleep on it. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. He was sitting on the cot in Clara Alderman's back room, still holding the coffee cup, with the look on his face of a man who'd stopped expecting the next thing to be good and was recalibrating. My name is Cole Harlan, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Harlan, she repeated. Not a question, just placing it. Not related to the family you're thinking of, if that's what you're wondering. It's a common name in this part of the state. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who'd explained this before. Cole Harlan. I was a land title investigator for 3 years, and before that I worked survey for the Army Corps of Engineers, and before that I grew up on a farm 40 miles from here that my family no longer owns. She heard that last part. The foreclosure. My parents' claim, he said. 1871. The first one I documented. He looked at the cup. The one that told me what I was dealing with. The room was quiet. Get some sleep, Cole Harlan, she said. I'll see you in the morning. She walked back to the freight office through the Hatchet Creek evening, and she thought about 78 families and a man who'd spent 2 years building a record of their dispossession and then lost it to the people he'd been trying to stop. She thought about a farm 40 miles away that a family no longer owned. She thought about her own father's freight routes, the families he'd hauled goods for, the ones that were gone now, and the places where the land sat under different names. She thought, I know what was buried. I've been driving past it for 3 years. She put Clover in the livery and went inside and sat at the table in the freight office with a piece of paper and wrote down everything she'd heard in order, because that was how she thought, in lists and sequences, everything in its place. Then she started a second list, what she could do about it. By midnight, the second list was longer than the first. She found out about Judge Cobb on Thursday morning when the Federal Messenger's weekly packet came through on the Dalton Road. She had the packet before anyone else because she'd started the contract 18 months ago, and the schedule ran on her wagon and nobody had suggested changing it. She did not consider reading a sealed official packet. She considered asking the right question of the right person, which was the postmistress Harriet Stoll, who knew the contents of every piece of official correspondence in the county and communicated this knowledge selectively based on criteria that Cordelia had never fully decoded but had come to trust. Circuit Judge's schedule, Harriet said. Cobb, if he's coming through. Harriet looked at her steadily. He's in Dalton the week of the 21st, stays at the Whitmore Hotel. He's hearing land cases that week. Something about a federal survey dispute up near Chattanooga. She paused. Why are you asking about Cobb, Cordelia? I have a delivery for the courthouse, she said. It was not entirely a lie. She would have a delivery for the courthouse by the time she was done. Harriet looked at her for another 3 seconds, which was Harriet's standard assessment window, and then appeared to accept this. He's a straight man, Harriet said. Cobb, I've heard him in session. He reads everything twice and he asks questions that tell you he read it twice. She refilled her own coffee cup, which was her signal that the conversation was about to become more useful. He's not from here, and he doesn't intend to be. I'd call that independent. That's what I needed to know, Cordelia said. She went from the post office to the parsonage. Cole Harlan was sitting up. He'd found a way to be useful in Clara's kitchen, which Cordelia gathered from the set of dried dishes on the counter, and the expression on Clara's face, which was the expression of a woman who'd decided she approved of someone without being entirely sure when the decision had been made. He was moving carefully the way a man moved when he was minding stitching, but he was moving. He looked at her when she came in. Judge Cobb, she said. Week of the 21st, Dalton. He's hearing land cases. He was very still for a moment. That's 9 days, he said. Yes. And the record that I have, he said, is in a location that will take at least 2 days to get to and back. Where? He was quiet for a moment, the calculating quiet she'd come to recognize. Not suspicion. The habit of a man who'd learned at cost what happened when information went to the wrong person. There's a tobacco barn, he said, on a property outside a town called Red Fork, 30 miles northwest. The property belonged to a family named Aldine. They lost the claim in 1872. The barn is unused. I put a tin box under the floor in the northwest corner 6 months ago when I realized the attorney in Atlanta was not who I thought he was. He paused. Everything's in the box, the documentation for all 78 cases. 78, she said. Yes. You said they got the record. They got the copy I'd been working from, he said. I had already made a second complete copy and put it there because I'd been suspicious for longer than I let on. He looked at her steadily. The original copy is gone. The box in the barn is what's left. She thought about 30 miles of road she knew well. The route through Red Fork was a regular freight run. She knew every crossroads on it and 3 of the families who farmed along the way and the name of the woman who ran the general store at Red Fork Junction. I can get there and back in a day and a half, she said, if I leave before dawn tomorrow. He stared at her. You're going to go get it. We need it. You're in no condition to ride 30 miles. She said this matter-of-factly. I have a legitimate reason to be on that road. I've been on it 50 times. Nobody will question a freight wagon going to Red Fork. You don't know what you'd be bringing back, he said. If anyone stopped you and searched the wagon, I run freight, she said. Nobody searches freight wagons, particularly not freight wagons belonging to a woman who has been making the same run without incident for 3 years. She looked at him. And I would not be stupid about where I put the box. He looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man who had not been taken seriously by enough people for long enough that being taken seriously required an adjustment period. Cordelia, he said. Yes. I don't have anything to offer you, he said. If this goes wrong, I don't have the means to. I'm not asking for anything, she said. This isn't a transaction. This is a situation where the right thing is visible and I have the means to do it. She picked up her gloves from the table. I'll be back Sunday evening. Keep the wound clean. She was at the door when he said, I'm going with you. She turned. You can barely stand, she said. I can sit in a wagon, he said. And I know the barn layout. And there are things in that box that need to be handled in a specific order if we're going to present them correctly. He held her gaze. I'm not sending you alone. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not wrong about the box. She'd been thinking about how to organize what was in it without knowing what was in it, and that was a problem. Can you get into a wagon without tearing the stitching? Give me an hour, he said. She almost smiled. She didn't because now was not the time for that. 1 hour, she said, and you're riding in the back, non-negotiable. She went to get Clover ready. They left before dawn on a Friday, which was the day Cordelia usually ran her Red Fork deliveries, which was the point. She had legitimate goods in the wagon bed, a load of harness leather and hardware for the Red Fork Junction store, and Cole Harlan was lying in the back behind a load of canvas-wrapped parcel freight with a blanket over him, which was not comfortable, but was also not suspicious because freight wagons often carried people on the back roads when the stage didn't run. He did not complain about it, which she noted. He'd asked one question before they left, which was whether she had a gun, and she'd shown him the Navy revolver under the wagon seat, and he'd nodded and said nothing else, and they'd set off into the dark on a road she knew, the way she knew her own handwriting. The morning came up gray and mild, the kind of early October morning that couldn't quite decide between summer's last stand and the year turning for real. And she watched the road and the tree line with the habitual attention of a woman who'd been making long freight runs since she was 19 years old. He slept for the first 2 hours, which surprised her, and then didn't. The body made its own decisions when the alternative was worse, and his body had decided that horizontal in a moving wagon was preferable to the alternative of staying awake. When he woke, he shifted and said, "How far is 15 miles?" she said. "You slept well." "First time in a while," he said with a flatness that was not nothing. She heard what was under it and did not comment. They stopped at a creek crossing to water Clover, and she handed him a piece of cornbread and a jar of water, and he sat on the wagon's tailgate and ate it with the careful economy of a man who was managing his body's resources. "Tell me about the box," she said. "What's in it, in what order?" He told her. He had a precise memory for documents citing specific dates and names with the facility of a man who had read the papers thousands of times. 78 case files, the original deed filings against the Meridian Development Company's foreclosure notices, correspondence between the company and the county clerk's office, bank records showing the financial flow from foreclosure sale to Halloran's personal accounts passed through 2 intermediary companies. "You got bank records," she said. "A sympathetic clerk at the Fulton County Bank branch," he said. "She made copies of 8 months of transactions before she was reassigned." He paused. "I don't know where she is now." "What's her name?" "Bessie Crane." "I'll ask Harriet Stoll," Cordelia said. "Harriet knows where most people in this region end up." He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again. She was starting to find the expression useful as a measure of progress. "You have a network," he said. "I have routes," she said. "Routes mean people. People mean information. It's the same principle as land surveying, just applied to social geography rather than physical." She handed Clover a piece of apple. "What do you need from a judge for this to work?" "I need him to open a federal inquiry," he said. "I don't need a conviction yet. I need an inquiry because an inquiry freezes the current state of the land records. It prevents Halloran from making any more transfers, any more foreclosures while the investigation is open. And it puts what I've built into an official record that can't be destroyed. Because once it's in federal evidence, it exists," he said. "Even if I don't." She heard the full weight of that. "That's why they wanted you in that alley," she said. "Not to kill you, to warn you off before you could get it to a judge." "Yes," he said. "They've had that approach before, with the 2 witnesses I'd found." He paused. "One left the county, the other—" He stopped. She didn't ask. She understood the grammar of that kind of pause. "Get back in the wagon," she said. "We've got 8 miles left." He got back in the wagon. She drove the last 8 miles thinking about the specific kind of man who built something for 2 years after it was used against his own family, and who, when asked why he kept going, talked about other people's families first. She thought about what that cost and what it built in a person, and what it required of whatever was left over. She pulled the wagon up at the Red Fork Junction store and made her delivery with the normal small talk of a regular customer, and nobody looked twice at the freight in the back, and she drove another 2 miles up the county road to a track she'd noticed before, without thinking much about it, leading to what the tax rolls she now realized had recorded as the former Aldine property. The tobacco barn was there. Gray wood roof held mostly by habit, the kind of structure that had been left to time after the people who'd built it were gone. She pulled the wagon up and helped Cole Harlan down with less drama than she'd expected, and they went inside. The northwest corner, third plank from the wall. He pried it up with a piece of iron he found hanging from a beam. Below it was a tin box, the kind sold at general stores for keeping documents dry, sealed with a latch. He opened it. She looked at what was inside, a bound stack of papers 3 inches thick, organized with tabs. She could see were labeled by case number. A second thinner stack, which she recognized from his description as the bank records. And at the back, a small leather notebook she hadn't heard him mention. He saw her looking at it. "My notes," he said. "The investigator's log, dates, sources, observations. The kind of thing you can't forge because it includes too many small specific details that only make sense if you were actually there." She picked up the bound stack and felt the weight of it. 78 families, the specific density of it in her hands. "All right," she said. "Let's get this back to Hatchet Creek." She put the box in the bottom of the wagon under the canvas, under the harness leather that remained after the delivery. Cole Harlan got back in the back, moving more easily now than he had that morning, and she drove back toward Hatchet Creek, the long way, the road that went through Millfield and came in from the north, because the long way was the way that didn't pass the 3 crossroads she knew Halloran's freight contractors used as staging points. She'd been driving around those crossroads for 3 years without knowing exactly why. Now she knew why. The sun was low when they came back into Hatchet Creek, and she pulled the wagon around behind the freight office, and they sat in the yard in the early evening light. And she opened the box again, and they went through the top layer of it together, the two of them on the wagon's tailgate with the tin box between them and the papers spread out, and he walked her through the first 10 cases in the order she'd need them. She discovered a mind like a survey map. Every feature in its place, every relationship precisely noted. He moved through the documents with the ease of someone who had built them and knew their interior architecture the way she knew the roads she'd run 100 times. He said at one point, "This one connects to this one through the March 1873 transfer," and held up 2 papers simultaneously, and she saw the connection before he finished explaining it, because she'd been listening to the structure of it, and the structure had a logic she could follow. "You have a good head for this," he said. "I've been signing contracts and reading land records for 3 years, she said. "I know what a clean document looks like. These aren't." "No," he said, "they're not." She looked at the stack. 9 days, she said, "to get this in front of Cobb." 9 days, he said. "Is it enough?" He looked at the papers, at the careful 2 years of accumulated evidence in a tin box that had been sitting under a barn floor for 6 months, waiting for someone to come and do something with it. "It has to be," he said. She looked at his profile in the low evening light, the set of his jaw and the bruising on his cheekbone, still dark purple against the weathered skin. She thought about a man who'd watched his family's farm go to a land company and then spent 2 years documenting the same thing happening to 77 other families. She thought about what that required of a person, the particular stubbornness and the particular grief of it, the way those 2 things had to exist together in the same body for the work to be possible. She thought, "This is the most honest thing I've seen a person doing in a very long time." She picked up her pen. "Start at the beginning," she said. "I want to write down the argument in the order we'll need it." He looked at her. "The order we'll need it," he said. "Yes," she said. "We." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the papers and started talking, and she started writing, and the evening came down over Hatchet Creek, and neither of them noticed. She woke at 4 the next morning with the argument still running in her head. Not an argument between herself and Cole Harlan. An argument in the legal sense, the shape of the case as she'd been building it in her mind since she came inside, which she'd learned to do from reading freight contracts and cargo dispute filings, and the one time she'd needed to represent herself in front of a county magistrate over a tonnage dispute with a rival hauler. You built the structure first, then you filled it, then you tested it by trying to tear it down, and whatever was left standing was what you presented. She lit the lamp and sat at the freight office table with her notes and the first layer of the documents from the tin box which she'd brought inside, wrapped in an oilcloth and set under the false bottom she kept in the floor for cash and papers she didn't want found. The structure she'd built in her head overnight looked like this. The fraud was systematic, which meant it had a method. The method could be demonstrated through a single case in full, and the pattern established by that single case could then be shown to repeat across the other 77. You didn't need to present all 78. You needed to present one so completely and clearly that the judge could see the rest without needing to be shown each one individually. She picked the Aldine case, the family who'd owned the barn where the box had been hidden. There was a particular justice in that she didn't examine too closely. By 5:30, she had 4 pages of notes and a headache, and she went to make coffee. She was back at the table with it when she heard the knock at the freight office's side door. 3 quick, 1 slow. The pattern she'd given Cole Harlan last night when she walked him back to Clara's, because she'd found herself giving him the pattern without quite deciding to the way you gave useful things to people who might need them. She opened the door. He was moving better than yesterday. The bruising on his face was doing what bruising did, which was get more spectacular before it started to fade. But his eyes were clear and he was standing straight and holding himself the way he held himself when he wasn't thinking about the wound. He looked at the table over her shoulder, at the 4 pages of notes, at the document spread. "You've been working," he said. "Since 4, she said. "Come in and look at this." He came in. She pointed to the Aldine case file she'd pulled from the stack. "I want to build the whole argument from this one," she said. "Show me everything you have on it, every document in the sequence you gathered it." He sat down across from her and pulled the file to him, and they worked for 3 hours before either of them thought about eating. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she took notes in her tight freight office handwriting, clear and numbered the writing of a woman who needed to be able to read her own notes at a crossroads in the rain. He watched her write and at one point said, "You're building a case summary." "I'm building the argument we present to Cobb," she said, "in the order that will make sense to a judge who doesn't know this county and has no prior exposure to the material. You've never done this before. I've written cargo dispute briefs. The principle is the same." She looked at him over the page. Evidence, sequence, logical progression from cause to consequence. The truth arranged so that it can be understood. He was quiet for a moment. Most freight haulers don't think about it that way. Most freight haulers didn't spend 3 years reading every land transfer and mortgage filing in the county records for their own education. She turned the page. "I needed to know which routes were changing hands and why. It's relevant to whether a freight contract will still have a customer in 6 months." He looked at her. "You noticed the pattern." "I noticed something," she said. "I didn't know what I was looking at. Now I do." She tapped the page. "Show me the county clerk correspondence." He showed her. The letters between the Meridian Development Company and the county clerk's office, written in the careful neutral language of official transactions, that on examination revealed a choreography, the specific sequence of steps required to manufacture a foreclosure from a legitimately held mortgage. They had to create a payment record that didn't match the family's own records. They had to file the discrepancy in a specific window of time that made legal challenge difficult. They had to have the foreclosure notice delivered in a way that the family received it too late to contest. "Every case uses the same window," she said. 14 to 18 days between notice and filing. "Deliberately short," he said. "Long enough to be technically legal, short enough to be practically impossible to contest." And the county clerk's office certified each one. Yes. The same clerk each time. He pulled out the last 3 years of foreclosure certifications. She looked at the signature. "T. Roden," she said. "That's the current clerk." It was the previous clerk for the first 40 cases and T. Roden for the rest. They were brother-in-law and nephew. She absorbed this. "Related to anyone at Meridian. Related to Halloran's business partner," he said. "A man named Stipe who runs the company's county operations." She wrote down clerk family connection Halloran partner Stipe, then drew a line to document trail. The lines on her page were starting to look like the maps she drew when she was planning a new freight route. Everything connected. Everything placed in relation to everything else. "There's a witness," he said. He said it carefully the way you said things that had been lost and you weren't sure how to handle the losing. "A man named Emmett Brooks. He was the night watchman at the county records office in 1872. He saw the documents being altered. He was prepared to testify." He paused. "He moved to Savannah in 1873. I don't know if he's still there." "Harriet Stoll might know," she said. "You keep coming back to that woman. She knows where people go," Cordelia said. "It's a specific and underrated talent." She made a note. "I'll ask her this afternoon." She went at noon on the pretext of collecting the week's incoming freight packets, which was a perfectly ordinary thing to do on a Saturday and required no explanation. Harriet looked at her across the postal counter for a moment. "You're building something," Harriet said. "I have questions about a man named Emmett Brooks," Cordelia said. "He was in Hatchet Creek around 1872, night watchman at the records office." Harriet's expression did not change. This was the thing about Harriet Stull. Her face was a tool she used precisely. "Brooks," she said. "I remember him. Moved to Savannah, yes? He has a daughter here still. Married name Addie Forrest. She runs the millinery on the east side of the square." Cordelia stopped. "Addie Forrest," she said. "I know Addie Forrest." "Most people do," Harriet said. "She's the kind of person you know." She refilled her pen. "Her father comes to visit at Christmas. He's well. He works at the Savannah Harbor office now." "Does he correspond with her?" "Weekly," Harriet said. "I know because I handle the posts." Cordelia thought about this. Then she said, "Harriet, there's something I want to tell you, something that's going to matter to a lot of people in this county. But before I tell you, I need you to tell me honestly whether you're prepared to hear it and not pass it to anyone who might carry it to parties that shouldn't have it." Harriet set down her pen. She looked at Cordelia steadily for a long moment, with the eyes of a woman who had been handling other people's information for 20 years and had learned to treat the handling as a sacred trust. "Cordelia Vane," she said, "I have not once in 20 years told a piece of information to a person who should not have had it." "I know," Cordelia said. "That's why I'm telling you," she told her. "Not everything, not the details of the box or Cole Harlan's name, but the shape of it, the land fraud, the systematic foreclosures, the county clerk connection, the judge coming to Dalton, what she was trying to do about it." Harriet listened without interrupting. When Cordelia finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment. "My cousin," she said, "lost a claim on Pear Creek in 1873. The bank said he'd missed payments. He had the receipts." She folded her hands on the counter. "He burned the receipts because he thought they were useless." A pause. "He shouldn't have burned them." "No," Cordelia said. "He shouldn't have. What do you need from me?" "A way to reach Emmett Brooks quickly, and anything you know about who in this county still has their payment receipts." Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up a piece of paper and began writing. She came back to the freight office with 2 pages of names and Harriet's agreement to wire Addie Forrest's father directly on the pretext of a postal matter. A wire that would contain, coded in the formal language of postal administration, a request for Emmett Brooks to travel to Dalton by the 20th. Cole Harlan read the 2 pages of names and was quiet. "You got these in an afternoon," he said. "Harriet knows everyone who's lost land in 3 counties and whose fault she thinks it was," Cordelia said. "It's a remarkably specific and useful area of knowledge." She sat down across from him. 8 people on that list have payment receipts. Harriet was confident of that. And 4 of those 8 live within a day's ride of Dalton. He looked up from the list. "You're going to ask them to testify," he said. "I'm going to ask them to bring their receipts to Dalton on the 20th and tell their stories to a federal judge." She folded her hands on the table. "Is that the kind of evidence Cobb can use?" "Original payment receipts compared against the county's foreclosure records," he said. "If the company manufactured the default, the receipt and the record will contradict each other directly. That's documentary fraud. That's exactly the kind of evidence a federal judge can act on." "Then I'm going to spend the next 4 days visiting 8 farms," she said. He looked at her with the recalibrating expression that she'd begun to think of as his honest face, the one under the measured, careful surface. "I should go with you," he said. "You're still healing." "I'm healed enough," he said. "And some of these families know me. I went to see them when I was building the case. I told them I was going to do something about it." He paused, and she heard what was under the pause the same weight she'd heard before. "I told them, and then I couldn't. If I go with you now, it means something different than if you go alone." She thought about that. He was right. A woman they didn't know showing up to ask them to trust her with their payment receipts and their stories was one thing. That same woman showing up with the man who'd sat at their tables 2 years ago and made a promise was something else. "Monday morning," she said. "If you're well enough to ride." "I'll be well enough to ride, Ma," he said. She almost said, "You sound very sure of that." She didn't, because she was beginning to understand that when Cole Harlan made a statement about what he intended to do, it was worth taking at face value. "Then Monday," she said. "But we do it my way. My wagon, my roads, I decide when we stop and when we don't. Your roads, he agreed, and said it like he meant it. She put the kettle on. Outside Hatchet Creek was settling into Saturday evening, and somewhere in the back of her mind the argument she was building was already testing itself against the next thing that would need to be true for it to hold. Monday and Tuesday they rode the farms. She'd been to 3 of them before on freight runs and knew the roads to the others from her county route maps. Cole Harlan rode beside her on a horse Clara Alderman had borrowed from the church's stable fund without asking the committee's permission, which said something about Clara's confidence in her own judgment and also about the church committee's reasonable disinclination to argue with her. He was right about what his presence meant. She watched it happen at the first farm, a place outside a settlement called Gravel Run, belonging to a man and his wife named Prather. The man answered the door with the closed expression of a person who'd learned to be suspicious of people showing up unannounced. Then he saw Cole Harlan standing behind her, and the expression changed. You, he said, not accusatory, something else. The word of a person confronting something they'd stopped expecting. Mr. Prather, Cole said, I told you I'd come back. The woman appeared behind her husband. She looked at Cole for a long moment. Then she said, come in, I'll put coffee on. They told him what they were doing. He listened, and then he went to a wooden box on a high shelf and brought out a stack of papers tied with string. He put them on the table. Payment receipts, he said. Every one, from 1869 to when they took it. His wife said, I told him not to throw them away. I said, Isaiah, you keep every one of those. Cordelia looked at the receipts. They were in order, dated quarterly, the kind of careful record a family kept, because they knew they were the kind of family that needed to be careful. Can you come to Dalton on the 20th? She said. With these, he looked at Cole. This time it'll work. Cole was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it cost him to hear that question. This time, Cole said, we have a federal judge. Isaiah Prather nodded. We'll be there. They visited 5 farms over 2 days. 3 in the first day, 2 in the second, because the roads to the second day's farms involved terrain that had gotten muddy from an overnight rain, and Clover expressed opinions about mud that needed to be managed diplomatically. They found payment receipts at 4 of the 5. The 5th family, a widow named Crane with 3 grown daughters, didn't have receipts, but had something. Cordelia hadn't anticipated a letter from the Meridian Development Company's Hatchet Creek office, dated 3 weeks before their foreclosure notice that said in language she had to read twice to make sure she was reading it right, that their account was in good standing. She held the letter up to the window to read it again. Good standing, she said, 3 weeks before they were declared in default. Cole looked at it. He was very still. That's a contradiction that doesn't require any interpretation, he said. No, she said. It doesn't. The widow Crane sat across the table from them with her 3 daughters ranged behind her, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for someone to see what she'd been seeing for 5 years. I kept it, she said, because it said good standing, and I thought that means something. If they said good standing, that means they knew I wasn't in default. And if they knew I wasn't in default and they foreclosed anyway, that's not a mistake. That's a choice. Yes, Cordelia said. It is. The widow Crane folded her hands. I'll be in Dalton on the 20th. She brought all 4 of her daughters. On Wednesday, Cordelia wrote letters. She wrote to Emmett Brooks, care of the Savannah Harbor office, via the wire Harriet had sent, explaining in plain language what they needed from him and when they needed him in Dalton. She wrote the letter as if she were writing a freight inquiry, specific and unambiguous, because ambiguity in freight contracts cost money, and she'd long since stopped leaving room for it. She wrote to Leonard Aldine, the youngest son of the family that had owned the tobacco barn, who Harriet said was now working at a sawmill outside Cartersville, and still had, according to his mother, who Harriet also knew, every document his father had ever filed related to the claim. She wrote him the same kind of letter. She wrote to Addie Forrest and asked her plainly whether her father had received the wire and whether he intended to come. Then she turned to Cole Harlan, who was sitting across the table working through the evidence summary she'd drafted, making marginal notes in handwriting that was precise and small and occasionally illegible, which she'd told him twice and which he'd acknowledged without significantly changing it. We need an attorney, she said, to present this properly to Cobb. He looked up. I know one, he said. In Dalton. A man named Porter Marsh. He was federal before he went private practice. He knows Cobb. He's not connected to any interest in this county. You trust him. I trust his practice record, he said. He handled 3 federal land cases in Tennessee and won all 3. He doesn't take losing well. He paused. And he has no reason to be in Halloran's pocket because he made his reputation before Halloran had enough reach to matter. Can you write to him? I can, he said, but it'll come better from you. She looked at him. Why? Because he doesn't know who I am now, he said. He knows Cole Harlan as the man who started a land fraud investigation and then disappeared. A letter from me is a letter from a man who failed. A letter from you is a letter from someone he doesn't have a prior opinion about. She thought about this. It was a reasonable calculation. She didn't like the reasoning behind it, the way he categorized himself as someone whose credibility needed to be rebuilt from outside, but she understood the practicality of it. Tell me what to say, she said. He told her. She wrote it. The letter was 3 paragraphs, specific and professional, outlining the nature of the evidence and the timeline and the request for representation before Judge Cobb on the 21st. She signed it Cordelia Vane, Freight Operator, Hatchet Creek. She took it to Harriet. Harriet looked at the envelope, at the address, and back at Cordelia. Porter Marsh, Harriet said. You know him. I know of him, Harriet said. He has a reputation for thoroughness that some people find inconvenient. She took the letter. First post tomorrow. Thank you, Harriet. Harriet waved her hand in the way that meant, this is what I do. Don't thank me for it. Thursday brought trouble in the form of 2 men on horseback who rode past the freight office twice between 8 and 10 in the morning. She noticed because she noticed things. The first pass she took in the horses, the lack of visible freight purpose, the angle from which they were observing the building. The second pass, she noted that they'd switched sides of the street, which was the kind of movement you made when you were trying to look at something from a different angle. She went inside and told Cole Harlan. He moved to the side window without hurrying and looked out through the gap in the curtain in the way of a man who'd been watched before and knew how to watch back. The one on the roan, he said. I've seen him. He works for Stipe. Stipe, the county operations man. Yes, they're watching the freight office. They're watching for me, he said. They know I didn't leave the county. They're looking for wherever I went to ground. He stepped back from the window. They haven't connected me to here yet, but they're working toward it. She thought. We have 6 days until Dalton. Yes. If they identify you here before then, it complicates things considerably, he said. I'd rather not be taken before we get the evidence to Cobb. She thought about the tin box under the false floor. She thought about the routes she ran, the roads. She knew the places along the eastern corridor where a freight wagon was completely unremarkable. We moved the box today, she said. And you move with it. He looked at her. Not to Clara's, she said. The parsonage is too visible, too connected to me now. There's a family on the Millfield Road, the Bowen place, where I make deliveries. They're good people, and they have a barn that's been taken apart and rebuilt twice and has spaces in it that aren't obvious. She paused. And they lost a piece of their land in 1871 to a mortgage irregularity that I didn't understand at the time, and now I do. He was very still. The Bowens, he said. You know them. I went to see them, he said. In 1873, early in the documentation. He looked at the window. They had a 40-acre piece along the creek. Good bottom land. They still farm the remaining tract, she said. They don't talk about the 40 acres. Cole was quiet for a moment. People who've lost something they worked for, they have a particular relationship to risk, he said. They're not afraid of it the same way. I know, she said. I've noticed that too. She loaded the tin box into the wagon tucked under 300 pounds of harness hardware she'd been planning to deliver to the Millfield Road smithy, which was a real delivery she'd been meaning to make for 2 weeks, and took it out the East Road with Clover at a working pace that suggested nothing more interesting than a freight run. Cole Harlan was in the back again under the canvas, and she did not think about the 2 men on horseback watching the freight office from the street because she had already moved past them, and they hadn't looked twice at a freight wagon because freight wagons were part of the furniture of the county roads, and nobody looked twice at furniture. She delivered the hardware to the smithy. She continued to the Bowen place. Hattie Bowen answered the door and looked at the wagon and at Cordelia and at the wagon again and said, You'd better come in. In the kitchen, with the door closed and the smell of whatever Hattie was putting up for winter coming off the stove, Cordelia told her what she'd told Harriet, and the families on the farms, the shape of it, the fraud, the evidence, the judge. Hattie listened with her hands around a coffee cup, and her expression the specific stillness of someone receiving information they've already suspected. The 40 acres, Hattie said. Yes, Cordelia said. Among others. Hattie looked at her coffee. My husband's family, she said. His grandfather cleared that land. 40 years of clearing and farming, and his grandfather is buried on the back corner of it. She looked up. We haven't been back to that corner. Cordelia didn't say anything for a moment. I need to ask a favor, she said. There's a man in my wagon who's been building this case for 2 years. Someone hurt him last week to stop him. I need him somewhere that isn't obvious for 6 days. Hattie looked at the wagon through the kitchen window. Bring him in, she said. I'll put supper on. The next 4 days had a rhythm to them that she found in retrospect impossible to describe, except by saying that it had the quality of something going the way it was supposed to go, which was different from things going easily. She rode between the Bowen Place and Hatchet Creek twice a day on the pretext of freight runs, carrying information and people and papers, back and forth in the particular way of a woman whose legitimate work was carrying things. She received a reply from Porter Marsh on Friday, one sentence, I'll be in Dalton on the 19th. She received a wire from Harriet on Saturday saying Emmett Brooks was on the night stage from Savannah. On Sunday, she got a message at the general store from Leonard Aldine saying he'd be in Dalton on the 20th with everything his father had ever filed. She brought the messages to Cole Harlan, who was sitting at the Bowens' kitchen table with a much-reduced stack of documents in front of him, the ones he'd pulled and organized based on her argument structure, the case he was building in the order she'd arranged it. He read each message and was quiet for a moment after each. It's coming together, she said. Yes, he said. He was looking at the Aldine message. She knew that the Aldine property was the one under whose barn floor he'd hidden the box. The family's dispossession made into the hiding place for the proof of it, and she thought about what that meant to a man with a precise memory for the specific weight of the things he documented. Cole, she said. He looked up. When this is over, she said, what do you do? He was quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought past getting it to the judge, he said. It came out honestly the way things came out when a person didn't have a prepared answer. Think about it now, she said. A day from now, there'll be no time. He turned a corner of the Aldine letter over. The investigation needs to continue, he said. Even if Cobb opens a federal inquiry, the inquiry will need someone who knows the case. Someone who can answer the investigators' questions, point them toward the right documents, identify which ones haven't been accounted for yet. He paused. And there are families I haven't found yet. The record goes back further than I was able to document. There may be cases from the late 1860s that I haven't reached. You'd keep doing the work, she said. If I can, he said. If Cobb takes it and opens the inquiry and Halloran is stopped from making any more transfers, there's time to do it properly, under legal protection. That's the whole thing, isn't it? She said. Time. Time in a federal court with jurisdiction, he said, and someone who knows the roads. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Outside the Bowen kitchen window, the Georgia October afternoon was doing what October afternoons did, going gold and long and smelling of leaf smoke and distance. Cordelia Vane sat across a kitchen table from a man who had built the most precise and difficult things she'd ever seen built, and she thought about the routes she ran and the people she knew, and the fact that she'd been driving past the edges of this for 3 years without knowing what she was seeing. I know the roads, she said. I know, he said. Neither of them said anything else because it didn't need to be said any other way. They left for Dalton on the 19th in her wagon, the tin box under the seat, and 300 pounds of legitimate freight in the back because she had a delivery due in Dalton on the 20th, and that was simply the truth. Cole Harlan sat beside her on the bench, not in the back. She'd offered him the back, and he'd said he'd ride up front and help watch the road, and she'd let him without making it a discussion. He watched the road the way she watched it, with the focused peripheral attention of people who'd learned to read terrain as information. She found this comfortable in a way she couldn't have precisely explained. It was the company of someone who was paying attention to the same things she was, which was a rarer quality than it ought to be. They stopped for the night at a way station she used regularly, a farm operation that rented barn space to freighters and travelers, and she slept in the wagon and he slept in the barn with the horses, which he'd insisted on, And she hadn't argued because the wound was still recent enough that she could hear it in how he moved. And sleeping in a wagon was not what the wound needed. She lay in the wagon looking at the stars through the canvas gap and thought about the argument she'd been building since Saturday morning, testing it the way she tested freight loads, looking for the place where the weight was distributed wrong. It held. She'd built it to hold. She thought, I have been driving freight in 3 counties for 3 years, and in the last 12 days, I have done the most important work of my life. She thought about that for a long time. In the morning, they drove the last 20 miles to Dalton in good time on a dry road, and she pulled the wagon up at the hotel that Porter Marsh had named in his wire, and they went inside. Marsh was already there. He was a compact man in a dark coat with the eyes of someone who read documents for pleasure, the kind of man whose intelligence expressed itself as attention to detail. He shook Cordelia's hand first, which she noted. You said 78 cases, he said. Documented, she said. Possibly more from the late 1860s. He looked at the tin box she set on the table. Let me see what you have. They spent the rest of the day and most of the evening going through the documents with Marsh. He asked questions in the same order she'd built the argument, which told her the argument's structure was sound because he was arriving at the same questions she'd anticipated. He asked about chain of custody for the tin box. He asked about the bank records. He asked about the clerk's family connection to Halloran's partner, and when she laid out the specific thread of it, he wrote it down and drew the same lines she'd drawn in her notes. When they got to the Widow Crane's letter, the good standing letter written 3 weeks before the foreclosure notice, Marsh picked it up and read it twice. This, he said, is what I call a gift. She kept it because it said good standing, Cordelia said. She should be congratulated for keeping it, Marsh said. This is a company document contradicting its own subsequent legal action. This alone would warrant an inquiry. He set it down carefully. With everything else, this is part of the most complete case of systematic fraud I've seen come into a federal court. Cole Harlan, who had said very little through the session, looked at the document. What do you need from us tomorrow? He said. I need you to sit in that courtroom and answer questions, Marsh said. And I need the witnesses you've brought to be prepared to testify to their specific documents. That's all. The evidence does the work. Our job is to let it. Cole nodded. Marsh looked at him for a moment. I heard you'd left the county, he said, after the Atlanta situation. I went underground, Cole said. I'm back. Marsh looked at him steadily. What brought you back? Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table at the organized spread of documents that Cordelia had built from the contents of the tin box. Someone helped me see that the work wasn't finished, he said. Marsh looked at Cordelia. She looked at the documents. Get some sleep, Marsh said. Both of you. Tomorrow's going to be thorough. She went to the room the hotel had given her and lay on the bed without sleeping and ran through the argument one more time in its entirety, from the first Aldine case to the Widow Crane's letter to the bank records, to the clerk family connection, to the investigator's notebook. And when she'd tested every joint and found them all holding, she let her mind go quiet. She was ready. Tomorrow they were going to finish it. The night before, a thing you'd been working toward had a specific quality that Cordelia recognized from freight runs that mattered: the long contracts, the hauls, where if you got it wrong, someone didn't get what they needed in time. The mind ran the road again and again, checking the load, testing the road conditions, and eventually you had to tell it that the load was right, and the road was as known as it was going to get, and running the route one more time in your head wasn't going to change anything. She got up at 5 and dressed and went downstairs and found that the hotel dining room was already occupied by Emmett Brooks, who had arrived on the late stage from Savannah, and who was sitting with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 6 years and was finally close enough to put it down that he could feel the weight of it in a new way. He was 50 or close to it, with the careful posture of a man who'd worked in official buildings and the watchful eyes of a man who'd learned what it cost to see something and say something about it. He looked up when she sat across from him. Miss Vane, he said. Harriet's wire had carried her name. Mr. Brooks, she said. Thank you for coming. Harriet Stoll wired me in a way that didn't give me a choice, he said. Not with resentment, with recognition. She is a persuasive correspondent. She is, Cordelia agreed. What I need to know, he said, is whether what I saw is worth anything now. It's been 6 years. What you saw, she said, is part of a pattern that has been documented across 78 cases. Your testimony establishes the mechanism at its origin, which is the piece we don't have from anyone else. She poured herself coffee. It's the most valuable piece. He looked at his cup. I left, he said. I knew what I was seeing and I left because I had a family and I didn't know who would hear me if I said it and I thought, he stopped. I thought I'd wait until I knew who to say it to. Now you do, she said. He nodded slowly. Now I do. Cole Harlan came down the stairs at 6. He nodded to Brooks, who looked at him with the expression of a man recognizing someone he'd heard about but not met. Leonard Aldine arrived at 1/2 past, a young man in his 20s who'd ridden through the night and was operating on determination and insufficient sleep, and who put a leather satchel on the table and opened it to show her what was inside his father's complete file. Every document in order, including 3 receipts from a period the company's records said no payments had been made. The widow Crane arrived at 7 with her daughters, 4 women in practical dark coats, who sat down at the long table in the hotel dining room and spread their documents out with the organized calm of people who'd been planning for this since Friday. Isaiah Prather and his wife arrived at 7:30. 2 other families she'd visited came in after them. Marsh came down at 8 and surveyed the room. Let's go through what each of you has, he said. In order, I'll be asking you questions similar to what the judge will ask, so treat this as preparation. They worked for 90 minutes. By the time they finished, Cordelia had identified one gap in the witness sequence and closed it by asking the widow Crane's eldest daughter, who had been present for every transaction in 1875, whether she'd witnessed the original payment. She had. She could testify to it. Marsh noted it and added her to the witness order. At 9:30, they walked to the courthouse. Judge Ira Cobb had the face of a man who'd seen a great many things brought before him and had learned to treat each one as the thing it was rather than the thing it resembled. He was Pennsylvania built, which in Cordelia's experience meant direct and methodical, with a low tolerance for decoration, and when they filed in, he was already at the bench reading, which told her he'd looked at Marsh's preliminary filing before the session started. He looked up when they settled. Mr. Marsh, he said, federal land fraud, 78 documented cases. 78 documented cases, Your Honor, Marsh said, with a potential for more from the late 1860s not yet fully documented. Primary defendant, a man named Walter Halloran, operating through the Meridian Development Company and associated entities. I don't know that name, Cobb said. He said it as a statement of fact, not pride, not apology. He operates primarily at the county level, Marsh said. He's made himself very visible locally and very difficult to reach federally. Cobb made a note. Let's see what you have. Marsh presented the Aldine case in full, first following the structure Cordelia had built, moving from the original deed filing to the payment records, to the manufactured default, to the foreclosure, to the subsequent transfer to a Meridian-affiliated buyer at below market price. He presented each document in order, and Cobb read each one before asking the next question, which was the judge reading carefully. He asked about the notary on the foreclosure filing. He asked about the date the default notice had been issued relative to the filing date, and when Marsh gave him the window 14 to 18 days, Cobb wrote it down and underlined it. He asked about the county clerk. Marsh laid the correspondence out. The pattern of clerk family connections to Halloran's operation. The specific signatures. The consistency of the window across all 78 cases. Cobb looked at the correspondence for a long time. He was the kind of man who looked at things for a long time, she thought, not because he was slow, but because he was doing something precise with the looking. This is a county clerk with systemic involvement, he said. The current clerk and his predecessor, Marsh said, related by marriage to the Meridian Company's county operations manager. Cobb made a note. Emmett Brooks testified at 11:10. He sat at the witness table with his hands flat on the surface, the way Cole had described him sitting when he'd looked at the documents being altered, and he told what he'd seen in September 1872 with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed it in his memory for 6 years and was finally giving it somewhere to go. He described the specific character of what he'd observed: original documents removed, replacement documents substituted, the altered records placed back in the official filing in a way that would appear to anyone retrieving them later to be originals. Cobb asked 3 questions. Each one was better than the last. The judge drilling toward what mattered: was Brooks certain of what he'd seen? Had he seen the specific documents both before and after the substitution, and had he reported it to anyone at the time? No, Brooks said to the last question. I did not. Why not? A pause. Because I was afraid of what would happen to me and my family, Brooks said. I was a night watchman, a temporary one. The county office didn't have to keep me on, and I saw what happened to people who said things about powerful interests in this county. He looked at the judge. I was wrong not to report it. I've known that for 6 years. Cobb looked at him steadily. You're reporting it now. Yes, sir. That's what matters at this stage, Cobb said. The widow Crane testified at noon. She brought the good standing letter and put it on the witness table and described how she'd received it and when and what had happened 3 weeks later. Cobb read the letter. He read the subsequent foreclosure notice that Marsh placed beside it. He looked at both of them for a long moment, and then he looked at the defense attorney that Halloran's operation had sent up from Atlanta, a smooth man named Beckett, who had been sitting with the careful stillness of someone waiting for an opening that wasn't presenting itself. Counsel, Cobb said to Beckett, your client's company sent this woman a letter stating her account was in good standing 3 weeks before foreclosure proceedings were initiated. Beckett said he would need time to review the documentation. You'll have time, Cobb said. It's going into federal evidence. The moment she'd been building toward came at 2 in the afternoon. Marsh had been leading Cole Harlan through the structure of the documentation, the way the 78 cases interconnected the bank records showing the financial flow, the investigator's notebook, establishing the timeline of discovery. Cole testified with the precision of a man who knew the material down to its constituent elements, answering every question fully and without elaboration, letting the facts carry what they needed to carry. Then Marsh asked about the fate of the original documentation. Cole described the Atlanta attorney. The moment he'd realized the attorney was not independent. The decision he'd made in the weeks before the second copy, the tobacco barn, the tin box under the floor. Cobb looked at him. You made a second complete copy before approaching the Atlanta attorney. Yes, Your Honor, because I was uncertain enough about his independence to want the documentation to exist in a place he didn't know about. When did you become uncertain about him? Several weeks before the meeting, Cole said. He asked questions about my sources that were more specific than someone with only the interest of prosecution would have needed to ask. He wanted to know where individual witnesses could be reached. He wanted to know the physical location of original documents. He paused. He wanted, I believe, to know what existed before he decided what to do with it. Cobb looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at the table. Cole was looking at Cobb with the expression she'd come to recognize on his face when he was doing the thing he was best at, which was accounting for the variables and giving the situation what it needed rather than what he felt like giving it. Where is the documentation now? Cobb asked. In federal evidence, Cole said. As of this morning. Cobb made a note. Then he looked at Cordelia. Miss Vane, he said. She straightened. I've been told you assembled much of the organizational framework for how this evidence is presented today. Is that accurate? I organized the structure of presentation, she said. The documentation itself was built over 2 years by Mr. Harlan. My contribution was the argument's order. What guided your choices about that order? She thought about how to answer honestly without it taking too long. You build an argument the way you plan a freight route, she said. You identify the weight, you figure out the sequence of loading that keeps the wagon balanced, and then you test the route for where the wheels are going to catch. She paused. The weight here was the systematic nature of the fraud. The most efficient way to demonstrate a pattern is to demonstrate one instance completely so the judge can see the pattern in the subsequent instances without needing each one to be shown in full. She looked at him. That was the principle. Cobb looked at her for a long moment. You have an instinct for what matters in a proceeding. I have an instinct for what makes a load travel safely, she said. In my experience, the principle transfers. He wrote something down. She thought it might have been a note about what she'd said, but it might just as easily have been a note about the next question. Are you an attorney? He said. No, Your Honor. Have you considered it? She looked at him steadily. I'm reconsidering a number of things, she said. The ruling came at 4 in the afternoon. Cobb had called a recess at 3 to read through the remaining documents at his bench, and he'd read for an hour without interruption, which Marsh said was a good sign that Cobb only read things for an hour when he was building the ruling in his head while he did it. When he returned to the bench, the room was very quiet. I'm opening a federal inquiry into the Meridian Development Company and associated entities, he said, on charges of systematic fraud in territorial land records, conspiracy to manufacture false mortgage defaults, and conspiracy to obstruct the course of legal proceedings. He looked up from his notes. I'm issuing an order freezing all current land transfer activity by the company and associated entities pending the inquiry. I'm also issuing a subpoena for the complete records of the company's county operations, the complete records of the relevant county clerk's office for the period 1869 through 1874, and the personal financial records of Walter Halloran. He looked at Beckett. Beckett said nothing. The inquiry will require a full investigative body, Cobb continued. I'm recommending to the federal court in Atlanta that a special investigator be appointed to oversee the complete documentation of all affected cases. I expect that to include cases not yet documented going back to 1868 if necessary. He paused. That investigator will need a point of contact in the field with knowledge of the affected areas and the existing documentation. He looked at Cole Harlan. Deputy Marshal's office can provide a field investigator's appointment, he said. Pending approval, it's not guaranteed, but the recommendation is mine to make. He held Cole's gaze for a moment. 2 years is a long time to build something like this under the conditions you built it. The recommendation will reflect that. Cole was very still. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. The same 2 words she'd heard him use before, the ones that came from somewhere real and cost something. Cobb looked at the room, at the families sitting in the gallery, the Prathers and the Cranes and the Aldines and the others, at Brooks, at Cordelia. The land freeze protects current holdings while the inquiry is open, he said. Families with documented claims should file those claims through Mr. Marsh's office for formal inclusion in the inquiry record. The inquiry is now the official proceeding of record. What was buried in the county clerk's office is no longer buried. He closed his folder. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room was quiet for a moment, the way rooms were quiet when something large had just happened and no one had quite caught up to it yet. Then Isaiah Prather said something to his wife that Cordelia couldn't hear, and his wife made a sound that was not quite a word, and that was when the room came back to itself. The widow Crane was sitting straight in her chair with her 4 daughters beside her, and she was not the kind of woman who wept in public, Cordelia had gathered. But something had let go in her face that had been held for 5 years, and the 4 daughters could see it, and the eldest reached over and put her hand on her mother's. Leonard Aldine was on his feet. Emmett Brooks was still sitting with his hands flat on the table. Marsh was saying something to Beckett that Beckett was listening to with the careful attention of a man recalculating everything. Cordelia stood up. Cole Harlan was standing at the front of the room, his back to her, looking at where the judge had been at the bench now empty. She could see the set of his shoulders, the specific quality of his stillness that she'd learned to read over 12 days, this one, being the stillness of a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been trying to get to for a long time and was letting the fact of it settle. She walked to the front of the room. She stopped beside him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. They stood in the courthouse in Dalton, Georgia on the 20th of October, 1875, with a federal inquiry opened and 78 families now inside the official proceedings of a court that would hear their cases. Outside the courthouse windows, the October afternoon was doing what it did, going long and gold and mild, the last warmth of the season available to anyone who wanted to stand in it. "It worked," she said. "Yes," he said. "Cobb's going to make the field investigator recommendation. He said so. You'll have to decide if you want it," she said. He turned to look at her. His face had the quality it had in the Bowen kitchen, the honest face under the careful surface. "I know what I want," he said. She looked at him. "The work," he said. "The rest of the cases, the documentation, making sure every family that lost land to this gets their case heard." He paused. "And the roads, someone who knows the roads." She looked at the courtroom behind them, at the families still gathered at Marsh, talking to the Cranes at Brooks, standing up from the table and exchanging a few words with Leonard Aldine. The accumulated weight of it, the specific density of people who'd been given something back. "I know the roads," she said. "Yes," he said, "you do." He reached over and took her hand, not tentatively, not with hesitation, with the directness of a man who'd decided something and was acting on the decision, which was, she'd come to understand, the only way he did anything that mattered. She looked down at their hands, his scarred, work-hard hands around hers, which had been doing work that was new and necessary, and that she'd been good at, and she thought, this is the thing that grows up alongside the work quietly and without announcement, the way true things grow. Behind them, Harriet Stoll's voice said, "They should probably get some air." Harriet had arrived from Hatchet Creek at noon without explaining why she'd come, because Harriet Stoll went where information was and considered explaining herself a waste of everyone's time. Addie Forrest, who had come with her father and was standing beside him now at the back of the courtroom, said, "Give them a minute, Harriet." Harriet made a sound that suggested she was allowing this on a strictly limited basis. The October afternoon came through the courthouse windows. Cole Harlan looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything else, because it didn't need to be said any other way. They went back to Hatchet Creek 4 days later after the formal inquiry filings were completed, and the families had each been recorded into the official proceeding, and Marsh had set up a process for the remaining cases to be added as they were documented. The road was dry and fast, and Clover was in an uncomplicated mood. Cole rode beside her on the bench again and watched the road again with the same focused peripheral attention that she'd come to think of as simply how he was in the world, alert to what was present without anxiety about what wasn't. At a wide stretch of road where the trees pulled back and you could see the county spread out below, rolling in October gold in the morning light, she said, "What happens to Halloran?" "The inquiry freezes his operations," Cole said. "He can't make any more transfers. He can't do the thing he's been doing." He was quiet for a moment. "The criminal charges will take longer. A case like this, with this many instances and this many witnesses, the prosecution will be careful and it will be thorough. Marsh will make sure of that." He looked at the road. "Halloran spent 10 years being untouchable. Being touchable is going to be a significant adjustment." "He'll resist," she said. "He'll try," Cole said. "But the inquiry exists now. The documents exist in federal evidence. There's no version of reality available to him where those things aren't true anymore." She thought about that. The way a truth entered into official record became a different kind of truth, permanent and resistant in a way that an unrecorded truth was not. She'd been thinking about that quality since the courthouse, the way the thing Cole had built, and that she'd helped shape into an argument, had become in one afternoon a thing that couldn't be destroyed. "The field investigator appointment," she said. "I'll take it if it's offered." "It will be." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because Cobb read everything twice and asked the right questions and made a note about every answer," she said. "That's not a judge who changes his mind between recess and recommendation." She looked at the road ahead. "And because the work needs doing and you're the only person who knows its full extent. Cobb knows that too." He was quiet for a moment. "When he asked why I kept going," Cole said after Atlanta, after they got the copy. "He didn't ask that. He would have asked it eventually," he said, "if the session had been longer." He looked at the gold October country rolling away below them. "I've been thinking about what the answer is." She waited. "It's because it was wrong," he said. "That's the whole reason. It was wrong and I knew it was wrong, and I had documentation that it was wrong, and as long as those three things were true, stopping didn't make sense. Even when stopping seemed like the only practical option." He paused. "That's not as complicated as it sounds." "No," she said, "it isn't." They drove in comfortable quiet for a while, the two of them on the bench with the October country around them. "Cordelia," he said. "Yes. I need you to know something." She looked at him. "The farm," he said. "The 40 acres my family lost. My parents are still alive. They're not on the farm, they're in town with my brother, but they're in the county." He was looking at the road. "The inquiry will cover their case. I listed it along with the others." She understood why he was telling her this, not as information about himself exactly, as a statement about what he'd done, built the record of his own family's loss alongside 77 others without prioritizing it, without making it the center of the thing, because it wasn't the center. The 78 cases were equal. His family's case was one of 78. "That's why you're good at it," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The work," she said. "You're good at it because you're honest about where you're standing. You didn't build the case as a personal grievance. You built it as a record." She looked at the road. "That's why it's going to hold up." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been alone with this for a long time." "I know," she said. "You're not anymore." He looked at her with the honest face. "No," he said, "I'm not." She kept her eyes on the road. Clover moved down the hill toward the flatland, and the freight county spread out around them, and somewhere ahead the town of Hatchet Creek was doing what it did in the mornings, going about its ordinary business in the particular way of a town that didn't yet know its ordinary business had just permanently changed. She learned Halloran's full name the following week from Harriet Stoll, who had obtained it through a postal correspondence chain that she declined to fully explain. Walter Gideon Halloran, age 54, a founding partner of the Meridian Development Company of Atlanta. a name on a hospital wing in Macon, and a reading room in Augusta, and the roster of every civic institution of significance in 3 counties. He was, as described, very well regarded. She thought about what it meant to build a reputation on the bones of other people's dispossession, the particular architecture of good works designed to make you untouchable. And she thought about the widow Crane reading a letter that said good standing and knowing even then that something was wrong keeping the letter because she trusted her own reading of what was wrong. That was what she'd built the argument on in the end. The specific stubbornness of people who refused to believe that what they knew was wrong could go unaddressed forever. The Cranes with their letter and the Prathers with their receipts, and Emmett Brooks and Savannah and Cole Harlan with a tin box under a tobacco barn floor. The people who kept things. She wrote a letter to her father that week, a longer letter than she usually wrote, telling him about the freight contracts and the federal inquiry and a man she'd pulled out of a mud puddle 11 days ago who had turned out to be doing the most important work she'd ever had the luck to participate in. Her father wrote back in 2 weeks, and the letter said, characteristically, come for Christmas if you can, and I'd like to meet the man from the mud puddle. She showed the letter to Cole Harlan, who read it twice and looked at her and said, would you like to, Mom, come for Christmas? Go for Christmas, he said. Together. She looked at him. He had over the 2 weeks since Dalton become part of the daily furniture of her life, in the way that things became furniture when they were the right things present, without requiring explanation, integrated in the way of something that belonged. Yes, she said. I'd like that. Then we'll go, he said. She put the letter away, and they went back to work because there was always more work, and they were both people who found that a satisfying condition rather than a burden. The federal field investigator appointment came in the second week of November. A letter from the federal marshal's office in Atlanta addressed to Cole Harlan, naming him as special field investigator for the Meridian Development Company inquiry with a jurisdiction covering 5 counties and an authorization to access official records and compel witness testimony within the scope of the inquiry. He read it at the freight office table. She watched him read it. Then he set it down and looked at it for a moment. 11 years, he said. Since I left the Survey Corps, I've been working outside any official framework for 3 years. You built the framework, she said. The inquiry is what you built. The inquiry is what we built, he said. He said it the way he said things that were true and needed to be stated plainly. She accepted this. The appointment gives you the authority to go into the county clerk's office and compel the records, she said, which means the cases we haven't documented yet, and access to the bank records under subpoena, he said, not just copies from sympathetic clerks. How long do you think the full documentation will take? He thought. A year at least, maybe 2. There are families I haven't found yet, cases I couldn't reach without official authority. He looked at the appointment letter. The commission will extend as needed. A year, 2 years, of routes she knew and roads she could drive, and documents she'd learned to read over 3 years of freight contracts and 3 weeks of intense education from a man who knew them from their foundations. The Red Fork Circuit, she said. I run it on Mondays. If we go together, you can do field interviews while I make deliveries. Nobody questions a freight wagon stopping at a farmhouse. He looked at her. You've already planned the routes, he said. I've been planning routes since I was 19, she said. It's a reflex. He picked up the appointment letter and folded it along its original crease and put it in his coat pocket. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. She looked at their hands on the freight office table. The documents spread around them. The argument she'd built, and that had held, and that had opened something that couldn't be closed again. We should probably get the wagon ready, she said. Probably, he said. He didn't move. She didn't move either. Outside the freight office window, Hatchet Creek was doing the things a small town did in the middle of a November morning, and Harriet Stull was on her way to the post office with the daily bundle under her arm, and Clover was in the livery with the opinions about mud currently on hold because the road was dry. The work was waiting. They were ready for it. She squeezed his hand once the way you confirmed a thing that didn't need words, and then they let go and got the wagon ready and drove out into the county on the roads she knew. And he was learning, and the November morning opened up around them like a county that had just become a different place and didn't quite know it yet but was going to find out. Halloran's attorney arrived in Hatchet Creek on a Thursday. Not Beckett, who had been the smooth man from Atlanta at the Dalton hearing. This was a different man, older, sent with the specific purpose of delivering a message rather than arguing a case. His name was Tilden, and he had the eyes of someone paid to find leverage and the manner of someone accustomed to finding it. He came to the freight office at 9 in the morning, which told her the message was meant to start her day badly. "Miss Vane," he said. He had not been invited to sit, but had done so anyway, which told her more. "Mr. Tilden," she said. She did not stop what she was doing, which was billing a freight invoice. Stopping what you were doing for a man who sat down without being invited was its own kind of message. "My client has an interest in your freight operation," Tilden said. She looked up. "Your client runs a land company. I run freight. There's no obvious connection." "Freight operations in this county rely on consistent road access," he said, "and on good relations with the major landholders along those routes." He paused. "My client is in a position to affect both of those things." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the widow Crane's letter. She thought about 63 other families. She thought about a man who'd spent 2 years building something under the most difficult conditions available. "Your client," she said, "has a federal freeze on all land transfer activity. He's not in a position to affect anything right now except the speed at which his attorney's bills accumulate." She set her pen down. "And if he's sending messages to individuals connected to the federal inquiry, that's something I'll need to mention to the field investigator." Tilden looked at her. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," he said. "It was adversarial before I was in it," she said. "I didn't make it that. Your client did when he manufactured foreclosures for 78 families." She stood up. "Tell your client the inquiry is proceeding and the records are in federal evidence, and there is no version of reality where that changes. Come back when you have something besides a message." Tilden looked at her for a moment with the calculating expression of a man deciding whether to escalate. He decided not to. "Good morning, Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Tilden," she said. He left. She watched him through the window until he was on his horse and riding east, not north toward the clerk's office, not west toward the parsonage east, which was out of town. She wrote down the time and his description and the content of the conversation in the inquiry log she'd been keeping since Dalton, because Cole had asked her to keep it, and she'd agreed, and it had already proved useful twice. Then she went to find Cole Harlan. He was in the records office. He'd been in the records office for a week working through the county clerk's files under the authority of the inquiry subpoena, the current clerk T. Roden sitting at his desk with the expression of a man who had recently learned that certain arrangements he'd taken for granted were no longer tenable. She found Cole at a table in the back room with document boxes around him, and his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and the focused, unhurried expression he wore when he was doing the work he was best at. She told him about Tilden. He listened without looking up from the document he was reading. When she finished, he set the document down. "He'll try again," he said. "I know. Probably through someone else next time. Not Tilden." He was quiet for a moment. "The inquiry being in federal hands limits what Harlan can do directly, but it doesn't limit what he can do indirectly." "He'll try to discredit witnesses," she said, "or find information he can use against people who've testified." "Yes." Cole looked at her. "The Cranes, the Prathers, Brooks." He paused. "You. What does he have on me?" "Nothing I know of," Cole said. "That doesn't mean he won't look for something or manufacture something." She thought about this, the specific quality of being in the middle of something that a powerful man wanted to stop and the things he might try when the direct approach failed. She'd been in freight disputes before, the kind where the other party had more resources and fewer scruples, and she knew that the most dangerous moment was usually when the direct approach had already failed and the indirect one was being constructed. "I'll talk to Harriet," she said. "Harriet will already know," Cole said. "I know. I'll talk to her anyway because talking to Harriet makes the information official in a way that matters." He almost smiled. "How does talking to Harriet Stoll make information official?" "Because after you tell Harriet something, the thing you told her is the version that travels," she said. "If I tell Harriet about Tilden's visit, and I tell it accurately, that's the story that will be in circulation by noon." She picked up her coat. "Halloran's version won't get traction against Harriet's version, because Harriet is a figure of documented reliability and Halloran is a figure of documented fraud." He looked at her. "You're using information as freight," he said. "The routing matters." "The routing always matters," she said. "It's just that the cargo changes." She went to the post office. The inquiry moved steadily through November and into December. Every week there were new cases, families who came forward once the inquiry's existence became known, in the county, people who'd kept payment receipts in shoeboxes and deed filings in trunks and correspondence from the Meridian Company and letters they'd reread 100 times, looking for the thing that had made no sense. They came to the freight office, most of them, because that was where the inquiry's local office was, which was not entirely official but was practical. And Cordelia had made it so by putting a sign on the door that said, Federal Inquiry Meridian Development Company, which Harriet Stoll had told her was technically irregular, and Cordelia had kept up anyway. Cole Harlan was in and out of the office every day. He interviewed witnesses at the table she'd set up in the back room. He reviewed documents. He sent regular reports to Marsh's office in Dalton, and Marsh sent responses that were increasingly favorable about the shape the broader case was taking. She brought him food when he forgot to eat, which he did with a consistency that suggested it was a long-established habit rather than a product of the current circumstances. He thanked her without looking up from whatever he was reading, which she'd come to find comfortable rather than dismissive, because it meant he was thinking about something real, and trusted her not to need his attention when she didn't need his attention. In the evenings, they sat at the freight office table and he walked her through the day's new cases, and she asked questions and occasionally made observations that he wrote down in the investigator's log with the note CCV alongside them, which she'd seen once over his shoulder and which she hadn't asked him about and hadn't needed to. The inquiry was building from the inside out, the way she'd built the original argument, one case in full, then the pattern emerging from the next and the next, each new case adding to the structure rather than requiring its own separate structure. 86 now, Cole said one evening, counting the case files. We didn't know about the families on Cutler Creek when we were in Dalton, she said. No, he said. I hadn't found them yet. He looked at the files. This is going to be the most complete record of this type of fraud in the state's history. Is that useful, the completeness? For the criminal prosecution, yes, he said. It's the difference between a judge seeing a pattern and being certain of a pattern. Certain is better. He turned a page. And for the families, every case that's in the record gets a hearing. Every family gets their documentation into federal proceedings. He paused. That's the thing that can't be taken back. She thought about that. The irreversibility of official record, the way it worked differently from the fragile reality of a thing that only existed in a tin box under a barn floor. Have you heard from your parents? She said. He looked up. They wrote last week. My mother wants to know when I'm coming to see them. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't seen them in 14 months. Go, she said. The inquiry. We'll be here when you get back, she said. Harriet and I can handle the incoming for 3 days. She looked at him. Go see your parents. Tell them the farm case is in federal proceedings. He was quiet. What? She said. I've been thinking about what happens when the inquiry is closed, he said. When the full criminal case is filed and the investigative phase ends. What happens? The appointment ends, he said. I go back to being an independent land title investigator, which is what I was before, except now I have a federal proceeding I participated in and a record of 2 years successful documentation and whatever Cobb chooses to say about the work. He paused, which puts me in a different position than I was in 3 months ago. A better one, she said. Yes. He looked at the table. I'd been thinking before Hatchet Creek, before the barn, before all of it, that the work was the thing. The documentation, the building of the record. And it is the thing, it's the most important thing I know how to do. He paused. But I've been thinking that it doesn't have to be the only thing. She looked at him. The roots, he said. Your roots. I know them now. I've been on most of them. And the work of the inquiry, the field investigation, it requires someone who can get to places without looking like they're getting to places. He was choosing his words with the care he brought to everything that mattered. And you said once very early that you'd been reconsidering a number of things. I did, she said. I want to know what you're reconsidering, he said. She thought about the attorney question Cobb had asked in the courthouse. She'd been thinking about it since. She'd been thinking about the reading she'd done over the last 3 years, the contracts and the land records and the freight documents, and how that reading had turned out to be preparation for something she hadn't known she was being prepared for, which was the feeling she'd had since Dalton, the feeling of work that was the right size for the person she turned out to be. I'm reconsidering the freight business, she said, not leaving it, expanding it. He waited. Freight doesn't have to be goods, she said. Information is freight. People's cases, their documents, their evidence. Getting those things to the right place through the right route. That's freight. She paused. I know the roads. I know the county. I know which roads Halloran's contractors watch and which they don't, which is valuable information for a federal field investigator. She looked at him. And I've spent 3 weeks learning how a land fraud inquiry is built. If I spend 3 more months with the right instruction, I'll know it from the ground up. He was very still. What kind of instruction, he said. The kind I've been getting, she said, from watching you. And from Marsh, who has already asked twice whether I plan to formalize my involvement with the inquiry. She folded her hands. Marsh thinks I should read law. Cole Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Do you want to read law? He said. I want to be useful to the work, she said. And right now, the most useful thing I can be is someone who understands both the legal framework and the physical geography. She paused. Reading law makes me more useful. He looked at his hands for a moment. Porter Marsh took 3 students last year, he said. He's in Dalton. He takes cases along the federal circuit, which means the work he does is exactly the kind that would be useful to know. He was quiet for a moment. He told me in Dalton before the hearing that you had the best instinct for argumentation he'd seen in someone without legal training. She looked at him. He told you that before the hearing. While you were in the back room with the Cranes, he said. He said it like it was an observation he'd needed to make to someone. He held her gaze. I didn't tell you because we had other things to do that day. She thought about Marsh watching her organize the documents, about Cobb asking whether she'd considered practicing law, about the argument she'd built in the freight office at 5 in the morning because it was the thing that needed building. And after, she said, after I read law, what then? Then you're a lawyer, he said. And I'm a federal land investigator with a circuit that covers 5 counties, and we know all the roads. He looked at her steadily. And none of that needs to be any more complicated than what it is. She looked at him. It's not complicated, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She picked up her pen. Go see your parents, she said. I'll write to Marsh. He almost smiled. He went. He was gone 4 days. She wrote to Marsh and received a response in 3 days that was 2 sentences. Yes, come in January. She wrote back and said she would. She ran her routes. She handled 4 new inquiry cases. She helped Harriet organize a second wave of family submissions for the formal federal proceedings, which had begun to come in through Marsh's Dalton office at a pace that suggested the inquiry was becoming known through the county, in the way that things became known when people who'd been afraid to speak started talking to people who were no longer afraid. The widow Crane came to the freight office on the second day Cole was gone without her daughters, which was unusual. She sat down across the table from Cordelia and put her hands around the coffee cup Cordelia had poured her. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want an honest answer. All right, Cordelia said. The inquiry, she said, is it going to hold this man Halloran? He has money and he has connections and he has attorneys. Are we going to end up in 5 years with nothing to show for it? Cordelia thought about this. She thought about what she knew, which was the specific weight of what was in federal evidence, and what a federal freeze meant, and what a subpoena for complete records meant, and what it meant that Cobb had read every document twice. The inquiry is going to hold, she said, because the evidence is documented and in federal proceedings, and the only way to undo that would be to corrupt a federal court, which is a different order of crime than what Halloran's been committing. She paused. He'll try things. He'll look for leverage, and he'll try to discredit witnesses, and he'll try to delay the criminal proceedings as long as possible. But the inquiry existing means the land transfers are frozen, which means he can't do what he was doing anymore. That part is already over. The widow Crane held her coffee cup. I've been afraid for 5 years, she said, that the letter I kept didn't matter, that keeping it was a foolish thing. It wasn't foolish, Cordelia said. It was the most important document in the case. Because it said good standing, the widow Crane said. Because it proved they knew, Cordelia said. That's the whole thing with fraud. Not just that it happened, but that the people who did it knew it was happening and chose to do it anyway. The letter proves the choice. The widow Crane looked at her. You're going to read law, she said. I'm going to try, Cordelia said. Good, the widow Crane said. She said it with the finality she put on things she'd decided were correct. Someone should read law who understands that things need to be kept because they matter. She put down the coffee cup. Tell that man to bring you out to what used to be my land sometime. I want him to see what good bottom land looks like, so he knows what we're getting back. I'll tell him, Cordelia said. The widow Crane stood up. She put on her coat with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had places to be and things to do and a federal inquiry proceeding on her behalf. Good day, Miss Vane, she said. Good day, Mrs. Crane, Cordelia said. Cole came back on a Thursday evening. He came into the freight office with the settled quality of a man who'd done something he needed to do and had come back from it cleaner than he'd left, if you could use that word for what happened when a man saw his parents and told them that the wrong done to his family was in federal proceedings. He set his hat on the table and looked at the inquiry log she'd filled in the 4 days he was gone. 4 new cases, she said. Harriet helped with 2 of them. I wrote to Marsh about the Cutler Creek cluster. He wrote back that the federal record is building well enough that the criminal filing will likely be ready by spring. He read the log. When he was done, he set it down. How are your parents, she said. Better than they were, he said. He was quiet for a moment. My mother asked about you. She looked at him. I'd mentioned you, he said, in a letter in October. He paused. She asked if you were coming for Christmas too. You said yes already, Cordelia said. I hoped, he said. That's different. I said yes to your father's letter, she said. Yes applies to your mother's question too. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. He picked up the inquiry log and set it back in its proper place. Then he came around the table and sat beside her instead of across from her, which was not the usual arrangement, and she looked at the small shift in geography with the awareness she brought to things she didn't want to miss. Marsh said January, she said. I know, he wrote to me too. He looked at the log. You'll be in Dalton 1 week a month at minimum during the study period. Marsh's schedule. The routes can accommodate that, she said. Wash can cover 3 of them. The Red Fork Circuit, I'll do myself. I'll come on the Red Fork Circuit, he said. The inquiry still has 3 farms out that direction I haven't interviewed. Then we'll go together, she said. Outside the freight office window, December had arrived in Hatchet Creek in the way December arrived quietly and without announcement, the temperature down and the light gone by 5, and the county settling into its winter rhythms. Clover was in the livery expressing his usual nuanced opinions about the cold. The inquiry log was filled to its 3rd page. The widow Crane's good-standing letter was in federal evidence in Atlanta where it was going to stay. Cole Harlan sat beside her at the freight office table, and she was aware of the 4 inches between his shoulder and hers with the same familiar weight she'd been aware of since the Bowen kitchen, the warmth of it, the specific quality of a person who was exactly where they were supposed to be. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About the argument structure, she said. The way I built it for Dalton. 1 case in full, then the pattern. It worked because the pattern was real. But I've been wondering whether it can be refined. She picked up her pen. If we know the pattern now, we can present future cases in a way that establishes the pattern first and then demonstrates the instances, which is more efficient. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her pen. She watched him write 2 words on the edge of the inquiry log. She looks at him. He looks at her. He put the pen down. I know, she said. Good, he said. She took his hand, not for the first time. For the kind of time that was past counting, the kind that had become the thing it was without either of them choosing a specific moment for it the way true things became what they were. We should work, she said. We should, he said. They worked. The December evening settled around the freight office. Somewhere on the county road, a rider was heading out toward the Red Fork Farms with a notice from the inquiry office. Somewhere in Dalton Porter Marsh was reading a case file. Somewhere in Atlanta, a federal proceeding was building in the records of a court toward the spring morning when it would become a criminal filing with Walter Halloran's name at the top. The work was going where it was supposed to go. And in the freight office in Hatchet Creek, 2 people who had come to it from different directions were building the same thing together with the particular care of people who understood that what they built was going to last. The criminal filing came in March. Not spring exactly, not the soft end of the month when things opened up, but the hard beginning of it when the county was still caught between seasons and the roads were mudlocked and Clover had moved past expressing opinions about the conditions into something more like stoic disapproval. It came as a wire to the freight office forwarded from Marsh's Dalton office to Harriet Stull, who carried it down the street herself rather than sending the boy, which told Cordelia before she read it what kind of news it was. She read it, then she read it again, then she went to find Cole Harlan. He was in the inquiry office, which was now officially designated as such by a placard from the Federal Court's Administration Office, a placard that had replaced her handwritten sign with something more authoritative, and which she had mixed feelings about for reasons she hadn't fully examined. He was reviewing the 93rd case file, which was where the documented count stood, and he looked up when she came in and read whatever was on her face before she said anything. She handed him the wire. He read it, then he sat very still for a moment. The wire said federal criminal indictment filed. United States versus Meridian Development Company, et al. Walter Gideon Halloran named as primary defendant. 22 additional counts against associated individuals, including T. Roden County Clerk. Trial date set for October. Your testimony required. He set the wire down on the table. October, he said. 7 months, she said. 93 cases in the inquiry record, he said. If we can reach 100 before the trial, Marsh wants 100. He was quiet for a moment. The trial's in Macon, federal court. I know. The testimony will be... He stopped. It will be everything we built, all of it, in front of a jury. Yes, she said. And every family that testified in the inquiry is potentially a witness. The widow Crane will be there, Cordelia said. She will dress for it. She paused. Isaiah Prather, Emmett Brooks, the Aldines. He was looking at the wire. Cole, she said. He looked up. Your parents' case, she said. It's in the 93. He nodded, not looking away from her. It'll be in the trial record, she said. It's going to be heard. He was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. She understood from the weeks of working beside him that there were things he needed to sit with in the particular way he sat with things, turning them over with the precision he brought to everything, and that the right thing to do was be present and wait. I told you, he said, that I built the record without putting my family's case at the center of it. Yes, she said. I meant that, he said. I mean it still. The 93 cases are equal, all of them. He looked at the table. But there is a thing I've been carrying that I don't have a good way to describe except to say that it's the weight of having promised something to people you love and then not being able to keep it for 3 years. He looked at her. It's a different weight than the work. The work is clarifying. The other thing sits differently. She thought about this. It's going to be lighter now, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She sat down across from him. Tell me about the farm, she said. Not the case file. The farm, what it looked like. He looked at her. The back fields, he said after a moment. Southwest facing. Good light in the afternoon. My father grew feed corn there for 20 years. He has an approach to corn specific to that particular soil that I have never seen work as well anywhere else. He was quiet. The south end had an oak grove that we used to eat lunch under in summer. There's a creek that runs through the northeast corner. Cold. It stayed cold even in August. A pause. I swam in that creek every summer until I was old enough to ride survey with my father. She listened. When the inquiry is done, she said, when the trial is done, what happens to the land? The inquiry can recommend restoration, he said. For families with documented fraud cases, the federal court can order the land returned or compensate for its assessed value. He paused. My parents are past the age for farming, but the land... He stopped. What? She said. I've been thinking, he said, about whether I could work the land, part of it, on the side. He said it like a man who'd had a private thought for a long time and was letting it out carefully. Not abandon the investigation work, but that creek and that south field. I think about them more than I'd expected to. She thought about this. We could plant something, she said. He looked at her. The south field, she said. Spring corn if the timing works. You know the soil. Your father knows the approach. She paused. I know which seed merchants in the county sell the best stock because I've hauled seed for all of them. He was very still. You'd plant corn, he said. I'd plant corn on a southwest-facing field with good afternoon light if the timing worked and the soil was right, she said. That's not an unusual thing to do in this part of the state. He looked at her for a long moment, the honest face, the one under the careful surface. Cordelia, he said. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something. Ask? He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. I've been in the habit, he said, of doing things alone. Not because I preferred it, but because the circumstances required it. And then the circumstances changed. He paused. And I've been thinking for a while now about what it means that they changed, about what I want the new circumstances to be. What do you want them to be? She said. I want the work, he said. The inquiry, the cases, the documentation. I want that for as long as there is that to do. He held her gaze. I want the routes, the roads you know, the specific knowledge you have of this county and the people in it and the way information travels when you route it correctly. He paused. And I want the south field and the corn in the creek in August. He was quiet for a moment. And I want you, all of it with you. Not as separate things, as one thing. The freight office was very quiet. Outside, a cart went past on the main road. Clover made a sound in the livery that expressed something between boredom and commentary. The inquiry log was on the table between them, 93 cases and counting. She had been over the months since October reconsidering a number of things. She had reconsidered the nature of useful work and found that it was larger and more various than she thought. She had reconsidered what it meant to be good at something, having discovered that she was good at things she hadn't known she could do. She had reconsidered the specific quality of a person's company, what it was to be around someone who paid attention to what she paid attention to without requiring her to explain why she paid attention to it. She had reconsidered in the specific hours of the mornings when she sat at the freight office table before Cole Harlan came in and after she'd already started working, whether the word alone described a condition she wanted to return to. She had concluded that it did not. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. All of it. He reached across the table and took her hand. She felt the weight of his hand and the weight of the inquiry log between them and the weight of 93 cases and the trial in October and January in Dalton with Porter Marsh and the routes she ran and the routes he was learning, and it was the right weight. All of it together was the right weight for a life that was the right size. Get the wagon ready, she said. We have 3 farms on the Red Fork circuit. Yes, he said. He did not let go of her hand yet. She did not let go of his. Cole, she said. Yes. The south field after the trial we plant in May. He looked at her. May, he said, and said it the way a person said something that was going to be true. The months between March and October had a shape to them. The inquiry reached 98 cases by May, which was close enough to 100, that Marsh said 98 was sufficient for his purposes, and they should concentrate on preparation for the trial. She'd been in Dalton 3 times since January, twice for inquiry business, and once for her first formal study session with Marsh, who was the kind of teacher who assigned cases before you understood the principle and let the understanding grow from the work, which suited her entirely. She passed her first set of legal examinations in April. Marsh wrote to tell her the results and added at the bottom in the same precise handwriting as the rest of the letter, "You'll be a formidable practitioner." The compliment surprised her more than the results did. She showed the letter to Cole Harlan, who read it without comment, and then put it down and looked at her with the look that she'd come to understand was the honest one, the one under the careful surface. He's right, he said. You don't know that yet, she said. I've only just started. I've watched you argue a federal fraud case for 6 months, he said. I know. She put the letter away. They went back to work. In June, the South Field was planted. Her father came down from his place in Macon County for a week and helped because her father's relationship to idle hands was adversarial, and he'd said in his last letter that he had opinions about the best variety for the Georgia clay and wanted to express them in person. He met Cole Harlan the second day and assessed him in the way he assessed things thoroughly and without waste. And at the end of the day, her father said in the direct way he had of saying things, he's the right kind of stubborn. She agreed. The creek was cold in August. She swam in it while Cole and his father argued about the corn, 2 men who shared a particular devotion to the specific soil of a specific southwest-facing field, standing at the edge of it in the summer morning, discussing yield potential with the focused pleasure of people whose argument was really in agreement. She lay on her back in the cold creek and looked at the Georgia sky and thought about the October morning she'd pulled a breathing man out of 3 inches of mud, the practical assessment she'd made that night, the argument she'd built at 5 in the morning in the freight office. She thought about the tobacco barn and the tin box, and the Widow Crane's letter and the courthouse and Dalton and Harriet Stoll carrying the wire down the street herself. She thought I was driving freight in 3 counties and I was paying attention, and the thing I was paying attention to turned out to be the thing that mattered. She got out of the creek and dried off and went to argue about the corn herself. The trial began in October. Federal courthouse in Macon, which was large enough for the occasion in a way that Dalton had not been. The families came. 98 documented families sent representatives, the Widow Crane, with all 4 daughters, the Prathers, the Aldines, Emmett Brooks, in a new coat. People from Cutler Creek and Pear Creek and Willow Branch, who'd heard about the inquiry through Harriet's network and come forward and added their cases to the record. Cole's parents sat in the gallery on the first morning. His mother was a small, steady woman who looked at Cordelia with the eyes of someone who'd had her son's measure for 40 years and was applying that measure to the person he'd chosen to measure himself against. She appeared to find the result acceptable, which Cordelia gathered from the way she didn't say anything about it, because she was like her son, the kind of person who said things when there was something specific to say. Cordelia sat beside Cole at the plaintiff's table in the capacity Porter Marsh had arranged, which was junior counsel, which was not a formal legal designation, but was a functional one because she'd been building the argument and organizing the witnesses since October the previous year, and Marsh wanted her where the case was. Beckett was back for the defense, and with him 2 additional attorneys from Atlanta, which told her something about how seriously Harlan was taking the proceedings. Marsh looked at the 3 defense attorneys and then looked at Cordelia and said without inflection, "3 of them. We have 98 cases," she said. "Yes," he said, "we do." The trial was 9 days. She had been in one courtroom before this one for the freight tonnage dispute, which had lasted an hour and a half. She had studied cases for 7 months. She had organized 98 evidentiary files and built the argument that Marsh was going to present. She knew the structure of the trial the way she knew her freight routes by having driven them in her head before she drove them in the world. But she had not been in a trial of this scale, and she paid attention to it the way she paid attention to things that were bigger than her prior experience, which was to say with the full use of everything she had. Marsh was thorough. He was also faster than she'd expected, moving through the case structure in the order she'd built it, one instance in full, and then the pattern demonstrated through the subsequent instances, and the pattern was visible to anyone who looked, because the pattern was real. Halloran's attorneys tried 3 different approaches in the first-day jurisdiction challenges, chain of custody challenges, and a challenge to the standing of the field investigators' documentation. Cobb, presiding by arrangement of the Federal Circuit, disposed of all 3 with the patient efficiency of a man who had heard better challenges on less meritorious cases. On day 4, the Widow Crane testified. She sat at the witness table in the dress she'd worn for the occasion, which was a dark wool dress she'd told Cordelia about, one she'd been saving for a significant event, and she put the letter on the table. She described every detail of it when she'd received it, what it said, what had happened 3 weeks later, why she'd kept it. She said, "Because it said good standing. And I thought if they said good standing, they knew I wasn't in default. And if they knew and they foreclosed anyway, that's not a mistake. I kept it because a person who knew was responsible for what they chose to do with what they knew." The courtroom was very quiet. Cole's mother in the gallery made a small sound. On day 6, Cole testified. He sat at the witness table with his hands flat on the surface and answered every question in the order it was asked with the economical precision of a man who understood exactly what the proceeding required. He was asked about the 2-year period of the investigation, about the tin box, about the decision to make a second copy of the documentation before the Atlanta meeting. One of Halloran's attorneys asked on cross-examination whether a man who'd gone underground for 2 years could be considered a reliable source of official documentation. Marsh objected. Cobb sustained, and then, in the way he had of reducing a bad argument to nothing, with a single question said to the defense attorney, "Counsel, are you suggesting that a witness's decision to protect his evidence from the parties who were suppressing it reflects negatively on that witness?" The attorney moved on. Cordelia was not asked to testify, which she'd known was the likely outcome, and had accepted because her role was the argument structure, not its presentation. But on day 7, Marsh called her to the witness table to speak to the organizational methodology of the inquiry, which was part of the official record. Cobb looked at her when she sat down. The same face she remembered from Dalton, the careful eyes behind the careful attention. You organized the inquiry's case files, he said. Yes, Your Honor, she said. And the argument structure for the federal proceeding in Dalton. Yes. You're currently reading law. Yes. He made a note. When you're done reading law, he said, what do you intend to do with it? She thought about the routes, the people she knew in 5 counties and their documents in shoe boxes and their letters from Meridian Development and their payment receipts kept because someone had told them they would matter. She thought about the widow Crane's 4 daughters and the Prather children and the farm that was planting corn again in the southwest-facing field. Cases like this one, she said, the kind that look impossible until someone puts the argument in the right order. Cobb made another note. Good, he said, and called the next witness. The verdict came on a Friday, 34 counts against Harlan, guilty on 29. The remaining 5 dismissed on technical grounds that Marsh had anticipated and accounted for in the filing so that they didn't affect the substantive outcomes. Guilty on the fraud charges. Guilty on the conspiracy to obstruct federal proceedings. Guilty on the charges connected to the county clerk operation. T. Roden convicted on 14 counts. 7 additional associated individuals convicted on various counts of conspiracy and fraud. The sentence Harlan 12 years federal prison. The court order the complete records of the Meridian Development Company to be turned over to the federal inquiry for review of all potentially affected land claims. A restoration commission established to review each of the 98 documented cases with jurisdiction to order land return or compensation. The gavel came down. In the gallery, somebody was crying. She didn't look to see who. She looked at the front of the room at the bench at the order that now existed in the official record of a federal court, and that could not be undone. Cole Harlan sat beside her at the plaintiff's table. She was aware of his stillness, the specific quality of it, not the watchful stillness of before, but the stillness of a man who had arrived. She did not say anything. There was a time for words and a time for the thing that didn't need words, and she knew the difference by now. After a time, Marsh put his hand briefly on Cole's shoulder and then began packing his case materials with the focused competence of a man who had a next case already waiting. The gallery was clearing. The families were talking to each other with the particular quality of people who'd been holding something for a long time and had set it down. She could see Isaiah Prather with his arm around his wife's shoulder. She could see Leonard Aldine shaking someone's hand. She could see Emmett Brooks sitting in the second row, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had finally given something to somewhere. It could do what he'd always hoped it would. Cole's mother was in the aisle with her husband, and she was looking at her son with an expression Cordelia would not have been able to describe except that it was the expression of someone who had been waiting for their child to come home from somewhere difficult and had now seen them come home. Cordelia stood up. She walked to the gallery railing. She stood beside Cole's mother, and his father stood on the other side, and the 4 of them were there in the clearing courtroom without saying anything for a moment because there was a kind of acknowledgement that happened without words when what needed to be acknowledged was larger than any particular phrasing. Then Cole's mother put her hand on Cordelia's arm. "Thank you," she said. Cordelia thought about a November morning with the argument she'd built in the freight office. She thought about a tin box under a tobacco barn floor. She thought about the widow Crane keeping a letter because she knew that good standing meant something. "He built it," she said. "I helped it travel." Cole's mother looked at her with those eyes that had measured her son for 40 years. "You know what I'm thanking you for," she said. Cordelia looked at Cole, who was still at the plaintiff's table, his back to them, looking at the bench. "Yes," she said. "I know." They walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon, which was the kind of afternoon that October produced when it had decided to be its best self, the light going gold in the air, the right temperature for a coat, but not quite demanding one, the Macon courthouse square, busy with the ordinary commerce of a Tuesday that had not known it was going to matter. Cole's parents went to find their wagon. Marsh went back to his hotel to write the post-trial filing. The families dispersed by ones and twos to their own arrangements. The widow Crane found them at the top of the courthouse steps. She stood there in her dark wool dress with the expression she'd had in the courtroom, the one of something set down that had been carried for 5 years. "I want to go back," she said, "to the land in the spring when the commission has processed the claim. I want to plant it again." "The commission will process the claim by January," Cole said. "The court order requires it." She looked at him steadily. "I know you'll make sure of it," she said. He nodded. She looked at them both. "You're going to be very busy," she said. "The Restoration Commission is going to need someone who knows the cases from the inside." "Yes," Cole said. "I have been appointed as the Commission's field review officer." "And you," she said to Cordelia. "January I finish reading law," she said. "After that I'll handle the legal filings for the families who don't have counsel. There are 23 of them in the 98 who need someone." The widow Crane nodded the nod of a woman arriving at a position she's already decided. "Good," she said. "Then I'll expect to see you at the Pear Creek farm in the spring." She went down the steps. Cordelia looked at the October afternoon. Cole stood beside her, and they watched the courthouse square in the way they watched things when the watching was the right thing to do. "The South Field," she said. "What about it in May?" she said. "We're planting in May." We said, he confirmed. "Your father has an opinion about the variety." "He always has an opinion about the variety," Cole said. "It's usually correct." "Then we'll plant his variety," she said. He turned to look at her. The October light was on his face and on the courthouse square behind them, and on the county that had just officially and permanently become a different kind of place. "Cordelia," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something." She looked at him. She knew his faces by now, the careful one, the calculating one, the honest one. This was the honest one, the one with nothing under it but what it was. "I know what you want to ask," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. The same word she'd said in the freight office in March, the one that had turned out to be the start of a sentence rather than the end of one. Yes to all of it. He reached over and took her hand. The October afternoon held them in it, two people on a courthouse steps, in a county that had been made right through evidence and argument, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to let things stay buried, and behind them the federal court record that existed and could not be unmade, and ahead of them the roots and the commission and the cases and the law and the Southfield in May. Not the end of anything. The exact middle of a thing that was just getting started. Cordelia Vane was admitted to the Georgia bar in the spring of 1877. She handled the legal filings for 41 of the 98 families in the Restoration Commission's first year and won 37 of the 41. The 4 she didn't win, she appealed. She won 2 of the 4 appeals. The other 2 she was still appealing when the commission completed its 5-year review in 1880, and by that point she had a case file methodology that Marsh had incorporated into his own practice and said publicly had improved his filing efficiency by 40%, which was a Marsh compliment, and she received it as one. Cole Harlan served as the Restoration Commission's field review officer for 3 years. In that time, the commission processed all 98 documented cases and an additional 31 that came forward during the review period. 129 families had their land returned or compensated. The Meridian Development Company's county operations were permanently dissolved. Walter Halloran served 11 of his 12 years. He was released in 1887 to a county that had arranged itself in his absence in such a way that his particular approach to business had no traction left. Emmett Brooks retired from the Savannah Harbor office in 1879 and moved back to Hatchet Creek, where Harriet Stoll found him a position managing the county records archive, which was the position he'd held before he left, and which he occupied with the care of someone who understood from the other direction what happened when records were not properly kept. The widow Crane planted Pear Creek in the spring of 1876. She rotated crops for 20 years, and the bottomland produced the way bottomland produces when it's worked by people who know it. Her daughter stayed. Her grandson was born on the property in 1883, which was not the only reason it mattered, but was a reason. Harriet Stoll received a formal commendation from the federal court for her role in the Inquiries Information Network. She displayed the commendation briefly and then filed it because she said that documents were for filing, and the work continued regardless of what the documents said about it, which was both true and a useful principle. The South Field produced good corn in May of every year that it was planted, which was every year. The southwest-facing light was exactly as Cole had remembered it, and the soil performed as his father had said it would, and the creek stayed cold in August. It was a farm that looked like a farm and worked like a farm, and had the particular quality of a place that had been worked with care by people who understood what they were tending. It was also the place where the freighter and the investigator lived and worked and drove the county routes and argued cases and built the record of what had happened and what had been made right. And in the evenings when the work was done, they sat on the porch that faced southwest and watched the light go off the field in the way it went long and gold and patient, the same light it had always been waiting for the people who belonged to it to come back and stay. The argument held. It had always been built to hold. 3 years after the Macon trial, a review of the commission's methodology was published in the Georgia Bar's Professional Circular. The author was listed as C.H. Vane, which told the people who knew them everything and the people who didn't nothing they needed to know, and this suited both of them. The review described a methodology for building federal land fraud cases from documentary evidence organized around the principle that a pattern of fraud is best demonstrated through one complete instance, followed by the pattern's replication across subsequent instances. It described the importance of original documents kept by families who had not known why they were keeping them, but had kept them because they trusted that the reason would eventually present itself. It described the routing of information through trusted local networks as a structural element of rural inquiry work that formal legal training often undervalued. It described the work as it was patient-specific and dependent on people who refused to let things stay buried. Harriet Stoll kept a copy in the post office for anyone who asked. 3 people asked the first year, 12 the second. After that, she stopped counting because she was busy, and counting was less interesting than the work.